Imagine yourself sitting in a quiet room, perhaps at dusk, watching the light change from gold to purple across a wall, and you find yourself asking a deceptively simple question. Why do I experience this moment at all? The light enters your eyes, information travels through your neural pathways, your brain processes wavelengths and patterns and memories, and yet somehow, mysteriously, there is something it feels like to be you experiencing this. There is a redness to the red, a warmth to the warmth, a quality of what philosophers call qualia that seems to exist in a realm entirely separate from the mechanical processes we can observe and measure. This is the hard problem of consciousness, and it has haunted philosophy and neuroscience for centuries with a peculiar kind of persistence. The mechanism at work here is fundamentally one of explanatory gap. We have become exceptionally skilled at explaining the easy problems of consciousness, the functional aspects like memory formation and attention and behavioral response, yet when we turn our instruments and our theories toward the subjective experience itself, toward the sheer fact that something it is like to exist, our scientific frameworks seem to fumble and lose coherence. We can map the neural correlates of seeing red, but we cannot explain why that neural activity should produce the experience of redness rather than remaining in darkness or silence. And yet this problem persists in our thinking despite the logical expectation that continued scientific progress should eventually dissolve it, that better brain imaging and more sophisticated neuroscience should eventually bridge the gap between objective physical process and subjective conscious experience. Instead, the hard problem seems to deepen with each advance, each explanation of mechanism somehow leaving the fundamental mystery more impenetrable, more resistant to the tools we have created, almost as though consciousness exists in a category entirely alien to everything else in the natural world. Imagine walking through a forest on a quiet morning, and as you observe the way sunlight filters through the leaves, the rustling of branches in the wind, the slow growth of moss on a stone, you begin to wonder whether each of these things might possess some form of experience, however minimal or alien to human understanding. Panpsychism is the philosophical position that consciousness or some form of mentality is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of the physical world, present not only in humans and animals but potentially in all matter, from electrons and atoms to rocks and rivers. Rather than consciousness being an emergent property that suddenly appears once biological systems reach sufficient complexity, panpsychism suggests that experience exists on a spectrum throughout nature, woven into the very fabric of reality itself. This perspective transforms how we might understand a simple electron moving through space, proposing that it might possess something analogous to subjective experience, even if we cannot possibly access or comprehend what that experience might be like. The appeal of panpsychism lies partly in its attempt to solve what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness, the seemingly insurmountable difficulty of explaining how physical processes in the brain generate subjective experience at all. If consciousness is not rare or special, but rather fundamental, then the mystery becomes less about how matter produces mind and more about how different configurations of matter produce different qualities of mind. Yet panpsychism persists in philosophical discourse despite its radical implications and the absence of empirical evidence, largely because it offers a counterintuitive but logically consistent escape from the intuitive problems that plague other theories of consciousness. We continue to debate and develop panpsychism not because we can test it, but because the alternative explanations seem equally mysterious and perhaps even more difficult to accept. Imagine a system so complex that its very existence depends not on individual parts working alone, but on how those parts integrate information with one another, creating something greater than the sum of their components. And this is where integrated information theory begins its peculiar journey into the nature of consciousness itself. Developed by neuroscientist Giulio Tononi in the early 2000s, this theory proposes that consciousness is not merely a byproduct of neural activity or a special arrangement of neurons firing in particular patterns, but rather a fundamental property that emerges from the degree to which a system integrates information across its components in ways that cannot be reduced to independent subunits operating separately. The theory introduces a mathematical quantity called phi, represented by the Greek letter, which attempts to measure the amount of integrated information present in any given system, suggesting that the more a system integrates information into unified experiences rather than fragmenting that information into disconnected parts, the more conscious that system becomes. Consider a person watching a sunset while simultaneously feeling the warmth of fading light on their skin and hearing distant music. And rather than experiencing these as three separate sensory inputs processed in isolation, consciousness binds them together into a single, unified experience that contains properties neither sight alone, nor touch alone, nor hearing alone could possibly possess. According to integrated information theory, this unification of disparate information streams into a coherent whole is what consciousness actually is, not merely what it feels like. And the theory further suggests that consciousness exists on a spectrum across different systems and organisms, with systems possessing higher phi values exhibiting greater consciousness, and those with lower phi values exhibiting less. Meaning that consciousness becomes not a binary property of either present or absent, but a graduated phenomenon dependent on architectural organization and integration capacity. Imagine a creature that is physically and functionally identical to you in every measurable way. It walks, talks, responds to stimuli, processes information, and behaves exactly as you do. It claims to see red, to feel pain, to experience joy. If you were to examine its brain, you would find the same neural structures, the same electrical patterns, the same chemical reactions firing in the same sequences. Yet there remains one crucial difference. There is nothing it is like to be this creature. Behind its eyes, there is no subjective experience, no inner light of awareness, no felt quality of what philosophers call qualia. This is the philosophical zombie, a thought experiment that has haunted consciousness studies for decades, challenging our most fundamental assumptions about the mind. The zombie's body processes information about pain without actually feeling it, recognizes colors without experiencing their phenomenal character, and performs all the cognitive tasks that we associate with consciousness while remaining utterly, completely absent from within. What makes this thought experiment so disturbing is not merely its logical possibility, but what its conceivability suggests about consciousness itself. If such a being could exist, then consciousness cannot simply be a matter of physical processes, no matter how complex. The very fact that we can imagine a perfect physical duplicate without inner experience suggests that subjective awareness must be something over and above the material facts of the world. This reasoning has led many philosophers to conclude that consciousness cannot be fully explained by neuroscience alone, that something essential escapes the grasp of purely physical description. And yet the zombie remains controversial, disputed by those who argue that the very concept is incoherent, that true functional identity would necessarily include consciousness. Imagine a person sitting alone in a sealed room, unable to speak or read Chinese, yet somehow they respond perfectly to written Chinese questions slipped under the door. What's happening is that they possess a vast rulebook, a manual so comprehensive and detailed that it contains every possible Chinese character, every grammatical structure, every contextual rule needed to match incoming questions with appropriate responses. When a question arrives, the person simply follows the mechanical rules, comparing symbols, applying transformations, and producing an output that appears intelligent and conscious to anyone observing from outside. To the observer watching through a window, consciousness seems to be happening inside that room, but the person inside knows absolutely nothing about Chinese, understands nothing of what they're saying, and is merely executing a predetermined set of mechanical instructions with perfect precision. This thought experiment, originally proposed by philosopher John Searle, challenges our deepest assumptions about what consciousness actually is and whether the appearance of understanding is the same as genuine understanding itself. The peculiar power of this scenario lies in how it forces us to confront the difference between syntax and semantics, between following rules and actually comprehending meaning. We've built a society increasingly reliant on systems that behave exactly like the person in the Chinese room, producing outputs that seem intelligent without any evidence that understanding or consciousness exists within them. Yet we continue to project consciousness onto these systems anyway, attributing intentionality and awareness to processes that might be nothing more than very sophisticated symbol manipulation. The Chinese room persists in our collective consciousness because it exposes something unsettling about how difficult it actually is to prove that any mind understands anything beyond producing the right outputs at the right times. Consider the peculiar intersection where quantum mechanics meets the study of consciousness, a theoretical landscape where some physicists and philosophers have proposed that consciousness itself might operate according to quantum principles rather than classical neural mechanics. In this framework, the collapse of quantum wave functions, those fundamental moments when probability becomes certainty and potential transforms into actual reality, might bear some essential relationship to the moment when unconscious neural activity becomes conscious awareness. Proponents of this view suggest that the brain's microtubules, tiny cylindrical structures within neurons, might serve as sites where quantum processes occur, and that consciousness emerges precisely when these quantum superpositions resolve into definite states, much as an unmeasured particle exists in multiple states simultaneously until observation collapses it into one. The theory attempts to bridge a profound explanatory gap in consciousness studies by invoking the one domain of science where observation genuinely does seem to alter physical reality, where determinism and possibility dance together in ways that remain fundamentally mysterious even to quantum physicists themselves. Yet this theory persists in academic and popular discourse despite significant challenges, partly because it addresses our intuitive sense that consciousness possesses some quality that ordinary material processes seem unable to explain, and partly because quantum mechanics itself retains an air of profound strangeness that makes it feel capable of mysterious leaps. We have somehow normalized the application of quantum theory to consciousness even as most neuroscientists remain unconvinced that quantum effects could survive the warm, wet, noisy environment of the brain long enough to influence neural processing. And yet the idea endures because it offers a kind of conceptual comfort. A suggestion that consciousness might require the most sophisticated physics we have discovered rather than merely emerging from patterns of electrical and chemical activity in biological tissue. Consider the peculiar experience of sitting quietly in a darkened room, fully aware that your brain is merely biological tissue, neurons firing in patterns, electrochemical cascades producing thoughts, yet simultaneously feeling utterly convinced that some non-physical essence of you exists somewhere inside that physical machinery, observing it all like a ghostly witness separate from the material apparatus itself. This is the lived experience of dualism, the intuitive sense that consciousness and matter are fundamentally different kinds of things, that your awareness cannot possibly be reducible to mere physical processes no matter how sophisticated our neuroscience becomes. When you contemplate your own thoughts arising mysteriously in your mind, unbidden and yet uniquely yours, there seems to persist an inescapable feeling that something immaterial must be orchestrating this symphony, that pure biology could never quite account for the ineffable quality of what it feels like to be you. The mechanism underlying this persistent conviction operates through several interlocking human tendencies. The immediate subjective distance between the thinking subject and the physical brain being observed, the seeming explanatory gap between objective neural descriptions and subjective conscious experience, and the deeply embedded cultural narratives stretching back thousands of years, suggesting that mind and body are separate realms operating according to different principles. What makes dualism so intellectually resilient despite the complete absence of any evidence for non-physical substances or forces is precisely this gap between description and experience, between what we can measure about the brain and what we feel about consciousness. A gap that seems to demand a non-material explanation even as our scientific understanding grows increasingly comprehensive. We have normalized this ancient intuition by encoding it into our languages, our religions, our philosophies, our everyday speech about having bodies rather than being bodies, and this linguistic architecture continues to reinforce the dualist assumption with each utterance and thought. Imagine a brilliant neuroscientist named Mary who has spent her entire life in a completely colorless room, where everything is black, white, or gray, and she has access only to black and white monitors and books that describe the world in purely physical and scientific terms. Mary knows absolutely everything there is to know about the physical properties of color. She understands the wavelengths of light, the neural mechanisms that fire when we see red, the exact chemical composition of every pigment in the visible spectrum, and the complete neurobiology of color perception in the human brain. She could describe in perfect detail how photons interact with our retinas and how electrical signals travel through the visual cortex, yet despite this exhaustive physical knowledge, there remains something profound that Mary has never actually experienced, what the color red actually feels like when you see it with your own eyes. Then one day Mary leaves her grayscale room and sees a ripe tomato or a sunset for the first time, and she learns something entirely new. something that no amount of physical description could have prepared her for. This thought experiment, originally proposed by philosopher Frank Jackson, raises a peculiar and troubling question about the nature of consciousness itself. If Mary learned something genuinely new through direct sensory experience that she could not have learned from all the physical facts in the universe, then perhaps consciousness and subjective experience contain something that cannot be reduced to or explained by pure physical processes. The mechanism at work here is a collision between two different kinds of knowledge, often called the difference between knowing that and knowing how. Mary knew the facts about color, but she did not know what color is like, and this gap suggests that conscious experience possesses a quality that transcends objective description. Imagine standing in a room filled with vivid colors, complex sounds, and rich textures all around you, and yet someone tells you that none of what you experience is actually there in the way you think it is. This is the peculiar position that illusionism about consciousness occupies within philosophy of mind, proposing that our subjective experience, that rich inner world of qualia and felt sensations we take for granted every moment of our waking lives, might be a kind of trick our brains play on themselves. The theory suggests that consciousness, as we commonly conceive it, with its intrinsic redness of red and painfulness of pain, does not actually possess the special metaphysical properties we attribute to it. And what we call conscious experience is fundamentally a cognitive model or representation that our brains construct and then present to us as if it were something more mysterious and transcendent than mere information processing. When you bite into an apple and taste sweetness, when you see the color blue in the sky, when you feel the sharp sting of a needle against your skin, illusionism proposes that these experiences are not truly irreducible phenomenal properties existing in some non-physical realm, but rather sophisticated illusions generated by your brain's attempt to model and navigate reality through the creation of what feels like private, subjective perspective. The mechanism underlying this persistence of illusion is that our cognitive architecture evolved to create useful models of the world, and one of those models is the illusion of consciousness itself, a narrative of inner experience that feels fundamentally different from physical processes, even though it may ultimately be nothing more than a particular way of organizing and presenting information that the brain has already processed through entirely physical means. Imagine you are sitting in a theater, and on the stage before you, a single spotlight illuminates one actor while the rest of the stage remains shrouded in darkness. And beyond the stage, in the vast auditorium of your mind, countless processes unfold in shadow, processing information, calculating movements, filtering sensations, yet only the information bathed in that spotlight of attention becomes available to your conscious awareness, becomes something you can report, something you can think about, something you can decide to act upon, and this is the essential image at the heart of global workspace theory, a framework suggesting that consciousness is not some magical property distributed throughout the brain, but rather a functional workspace where information is broadcast to a wide audience of cognitive processes that need access to it. In this model, the brain operates like a bustling theater with many backstage workers, lighting technicians, and stagehands all performing essential tasks outside of public view. And occasionally, certain pieces of information are selected and elevated onto that central stage, that global workspace, where they can be seen by multiple systems simultaneously, where memory systems can access them, where planning systems can utilize them, where language and reasoning systems can incorporate them into thought, and the moment information reaches this workspace, it crosses a threshold into conscious experience, becoming something you are aware of, something that feels like it is happening to you in real time. The theory emerged from cognitive science research, revealing that the brain processes vastly more information than consciousness could ever handle, that visual information alone floods the brain with more data in a single second than consciousness could ever integrate. Yet somehow the brain efficiently filters this information, selecting only what is most relevant or novel or important for the current goals and needs, routing that selected information to this workspace where it becomes shared currency, usable by any system that requires it. Imagine that consciousness doesn't arise from the mere firing of neurons across the brain's vast networks, but instead emerges from something far deeper and stranger, something occurring at the quantum level within the tiny structures called microtubules that exist inside every cell. This is the central proposal of orchestrated objective reduction, commonly known as Orch-OR, a theory developed by physicist Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff in the 1990s. According to this view, consciousness requires quantum processes happening at scales so small that the classical physics governing normal neural activity cannot fully explain them, and these quantum events become orchestrated through the architecture of microtubules that form the cellular skeleton within neurons themselves. The theory suggests that when quantum superpositions within these microtubules reach a certain threshold of complexity, they undergo what Penrose calls objective reduction, a collapse that corresponds to a moment of conscious experience, and this process happens repeatedly, creating the continuous stream of awareness we feel. What makes this theory particularly striking is that it bridges two domains of physics that normally never interact: the quantum realm of subatomic particles and the classical realm of everyday objects and neural activity. The theory proposes that consciousness may be a fundamental feature of the universe at the quantum level, not merely an emergent property of information processing. Despite its intellectual ambition and the considerable expertise of its proponents, Orch-OR remains highly speculative and has faced sustained criticism from neuroscientists and philosophers who argue that quantum effects would decohere far too quickly in the warm, wet environment of the brain to play any meaningful role in consciousness. Many researchers contend that there is insufficient empirical evidence to support the idea that microtubules are the seat of consciousness, or that quantum processes are necessary to explain subjective experience. Imagine waking up in your bedroom and looking around at the solid furniture, the walls, the window through which light streams in, and you assume without question that these objects exist independently of your perception of them, that they would be there even if you closed your eyes or left the room entirely. Now consider the philosophical position of idealism, which proposes something radically different: that what we call the physical world is fundamentally composed not of matter existing in some objective external realm, but rather of ideas, perceptions, and consciousness itself. In this view, the chair you sit upon, the ground beneath your feet, the vast expanse of space extending beyond your vision, all of these things do not possess an independent material existence separate from mind. Instead, they exist as they do because they are perceived, experienced, and held within consciousness, whether that consciousness belongs to you individually or to some universal mind observing all things. The mechanism behind idealism rests on a deceptively simple logical observation that we never actually encounter matter itself in its raw, unperceived form. What we encounter are always sensory impressions, mental representations, the experience of redness when we see a rose, or the sensation of hardness when we touch a table. We assume these sensations correspond to external material objects, yet idealism asks why we should make this assumption at all, why we should posit the existence of something we can never directly access, something that exists entirely beyond the reach of experience. The theory suggests that matter is an unnecessary hypothesis, that consciousness itself is the fundamental substance of reality, and that what we mistake for a material world is actually an intricate tapestry of perceptions and ideas. Consider the possibility that consciousness itself might be nothing more than a process occurring within a vast computational system, that the universe we perceive and the thoughts we believe we think might all be products of an elaborate simulation running on some incomprehensibly advanced infrastructure, and that what we experience as awareness could be merely the rendering of sensory data within this system. The simulation hypothesis suggests that consciousness is not something fundamentally real or uniquely generated by biological processes, but rather a programmed phenomenon, a pattern of information processing designed to create the illusion of subjective experience, much like how a character in a video game might possess what appears to be awareness without any genuine inner life. What drives this line of thinking is a relatively straightforward logical argument based on probability and technological trajectory. If civilizations can advance sufficiently, they would eventually develop the computing power necessary to create realistic simulations containing conscious agents within them. And if infinite simulations could exist while only one base reality could be real, then statistically, we are far more likely to be within a simulation than to exist in the original reality itself. This reasoning creates a peculiar framework for understanding consciousness, suggesting that your sense of self, your memories, your sense of choice and agency might all be subroutines executing within some vast program, that the world feels coherent and continuous only because the simulation renders it that way, and that your subjective experience of being a conscious entity observing reality might actually be nothing more than information processing indistinguishable from genuine awareness. Imagine sitting in a quiet room and experiencing the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, or the particular quality of what it feels like to taste coffee on your tongue on a cold morning. And you have entered the territory that philosophers call qualia, the raw, subjective experience of consciousness itself. This is the foundation of Thomas Nagel's famous What is it like to be a bat?, which poses a deceptively simple question that has haunted consciousness studies for decades. If we could somehow know every single physical fact about a bat's echolocation system, every neural firing pattern, every neurochemical process, would we ever truly understand what it is like for the bat to experience the world through sonar, to feel what that sensation is actually like from the inside? The theory suggests that consciousness might fundamentally be about this irreducible subjective quality, this first-person perspective that cannot be fully captured or translated into objective, third-person descriptions, no matter how complete our scientific knowledge becomes. When you see the color blue, your brain undergoes specific physical processes. Photons enter your eye, cone cells fire, neural signals travel through the visual cortex. Yet there remains something about the experience of blueness itself that seems to exist beyond and above these mechanisms, a qualitative character that has no physical equivalent. This gap between the objective description of a process and the subjective experience of it creates what researchers call the explanatory gap, a space where the most rigorous neuroscience and physics appear insufficient to bridge the divide between matter and mind. Yet despite this profound puzzle, despite the fact that we have no clear mechanism for how subjective experience arises from objective physical processes, we live as though we understand each other's inner worlds. We trust that your red is somewhat like my red, that your pain carries similar meaning to mine, and we build entire societies on this mutual assumption of shared consciousness without ever solving the fundamental mystery at the heart of it all. Imagine sitting in a quiet room, fully convinced that you are experiencing the redness of a rose, the sting of embarrassment, the weight of sadness on your chest, and the vivid imagery of a childhood memory playing across your mind's eye. These seem like the most obvious and undeniable facts of your existence, the very foundation upon which you know yourself to be real and conscious. Yet eliminative materialism suggests something profoundly disorienting. Perhaps none of these subjective experiences actually exist in the way you believe they do. Perhaps consciousness, qualia, intentionality, and the entire framework of folk psychology that humanity has used for millennia to describe the inner life are not discoveries about reality, but rather elaborate fictions we inherited from our pre-scientific ancestors. The theory proposes that just as we once believed in witches, demons, and phlogiston before science corrected us, we may one day discover that our cherished vocabulary of the mind, thoughts, feelings, sensations, beliefs, desires, refers to nothing real at all, and that advanced neuroscience will simply eliminate these terms from our understanding entirely, replacing them with descriptions of neural processes we cannot yet fully comprehend. The psychological mechanism underlying this theory's persistence lies in a curious inversion of what usually drives our certainty about consciousness. It is precisely because subjective experience feels so immediate and impossible to doubt that eliminative materialists question whether it truly exists as we describe it. Our brains evolved to model the world efficiently, not to understand themselves accurately, and our intuitions about consciousness may be systematic misrepresentations, useful survival tools that happen to deceive us about their own nature. What makes this perspective so difficult to dismiss is that it echoes a pattern we have seen repeatedly in scientific history, where our deepest convictions about reality gave way to entirely different frameworks once we had the tools to look more carefully. Consider the moment you taste coffee for the first time in the morning, that specific experience of bitterness combined with warmth and aroma that floods your consciousness in a way that seems entirely unique to you and you alone. A subjective quality of experience that philosophers call qualia, which represents perhaps the most intimate and ineffable aspect of consciousness itself. When you see the color red, you experience something called the redness of red, a phenomenological quality that exists only in your mind, and no amount of describing the wavelength of light or the neural firing patterns in your visual cortex can fully capture what that redness actually feels like from the inside of your subjective experience. This is the fundamental mystery of qualia, that subjective, felt qualities of experience seem to possess a private character that resists objective description, that no third party can ever truly know what chocolate tastes like to you or what your particular shade of sadness feels like when you hear a melancholic song. The mechanism underlying this puzzle operates within the explanatory gap between physical processes and subjective experience, the seemingly unbridgeable space between objective facts about the brain and the subjective facts about what it is like to be a conscious creature having specific experiences. Neuroscience can map which regions activate when you see red or taste coffee, but mapping the activation tells us nothing about the qualia itself, about the intrinsic what-it-is-likeness that accompanies the neural activity. Yet we have normalized this profound mystery so thoroughly that most people rarely pause to consider it, moving through their lives experiencing these rich, colorful, textured qualia without recognizing that their existence represents one of consciousness study's most stubborn and resisting puzzles, a phenomenon that may ultimately reveal something fundamental about the nature of mind itself, or about the limits of our ability to understand mind through purely physical description. Imagine standing in a room filled with objects, each one seeming to possess an independent existence entirely separate from your perception of it. The chair remains a chair whether you look at it or not, the book sits on the shelf with its pages intact and its story contained within, the light continues to refract through the window at precise angles governed by the laws of physics. This is the fundamental intuition behind conscious realism, a philosophical position asserting that consciousness itself is part of the basic fabric of reality, not merely an emergent property arising from physical processes, but rather a fundamental feature of the universe as irreducible and primary as space, time, and matter. According to this view, experiences and conscious states are not illusions or byproducts of neural activity, but rather genuine constituents of what actually exists. The theory suggests that consciousness is woven into the structure of reality at its deepest level, that the subjective character of your experience when you see that chair is not simply a trick of biology, but is instead something genuinely real and fundamental. The mechanism underlying this perspective emerges from the observation that all our knowledge of the physical world ultimately comes through consciousness, that we cannot escape the fact that we know the universe through the lens of experience. Conscious realism takes this insight seriously and proposes that rather than consciousness being some strange exception to a fundamentally non-conscious universe, perhaps consciousness is actually central to how reality itself is organized. What persists despite the seeming metaphysical extravagance of this view is a kind of philosophical humility, the recognition that placing consciousness as fundamental rather than derivative solves certain persistent puzzles about the mind-body problem that materialism has struggled with for centuries. The theory invites us to stop treating consciousness as something that needs to be explained away and instead to accept it as genuinely real, as part of the basic furniture of existence. Consider the peculiar paradox that sits at the heart of quantum mechanics, where the act of observation seems to fundamentally alter reality itself, as if the universe exists in a state of infinite possibility until the moment a conscious mind decides to look at it. And in that decisive instant of awareness, all those possibilities collapse into a single, definite outcome that we then perceive as reality. This is the quantum measurement problem, and it has inspired a philosophical interpretation suggesting that consciousness itself might be the mechanism responsible for collapsing the wave function, for transforming potential into actual, for making the fuzzy realm of quantum superposition suddenly snap into the concrete world of classical physics that we experience with our senses and our minds. The mechanism operates on a deceptively simple logic. Before observation, a particle exists in what physicists call a superposition, simultaneously in multiple states, multiple locations, multiple configurations all at once, and yet the moment a conscious observer attempts to measure or perceive that particle, the superposition collapses and the particle becomes singular, definite, real in exactly one way. This suggests that consciousness possesses a unique power, that the universe behaves differently when witnessed by a mind than when it exists in the absence of any observer whatsoever. That awareness itself is not merely a passive reception of information, but an active force that shapes physical reality at the most fundamental level. Biocentrism proposes a radical inversion of how we understand the relationship between consciousness and the physical universe, suggesting that life and consciousness are not emergent byproducts of matter, but rather fundamental to reality itself, with the universe existing because observers are present to perceive it. In this view, space and time are not objective containers in which life happens to occur, but rather constructs of the mind that only become real through the act of observation, meaning that without conscious beings to collapse the wave function and actualize possibility into concrete experience, the universe would exist only as potential rather than manifest reality. The theory draws from interpretations of quantum mechanics, where the observer effect seemingly demonstrates that particles behave differently when measured, suggesting that consciousness plays an active role in determining physical outcomes rather than merely witnessing a predetermined universe unfolding according to fixed laws. What makes biocentrism psychologically compelling is its appeal to our deepest intuition that we are somehow central to existence, that our experience matters not as insignificant consciousness trapped in an indifferent cosmos, but as the very mechanism through which the cosmos becomes aware of itself, reinstating humanity to a position of cosmic importance that earlier worldviews granted us before scientific materialism seemed to demote us to accidental arrangements of atoms. The mechanism of its persistence lies in how it allows us to dissolve the anxiety produced by modern physics and evolutionary theory, which positions human consciousness as a late arrival in an ancient universe, a minor phenomenon in an incomprehensibly vast space, by reframing consciousness as the ground floor of reality itself, the fundamental ingredient without which nothing could possibly exist or have meaning. Imagine a conversation where you find yourself explaining why you believe something, and as you speak, the very act of explaining it makes you believe it more deeply, which then gives you more conviction to explain it further, which strengthens your belief even more in an endless cycle that feeds back into itself without ever touching ground in external reality. This is the essence of a strange loop, a concept that mathematician and cognitive scientist Douglas Hofstadter proposed as potentially central to how consciousness itself arises, where a system becomes aware of itself by looping back through its own processes in such a way that the observer and the observed collapse into the same entity. The mechanism at work here involves what happens when information about a system becomes part of that system, when your thoughts about your thoughts become the primary content of your consciousness, when you reflect on your reflections endlessly, creating layers of recursion that somehow generate the felt sense of being a unified self looking outward at a world. In neurology and psychology, we see this constantly. The more you think about being anxious, the more anxious you become. The more you focus on not thinking about something, the more it occupies your mind. The more you believe you are a particular kind of person, the more you act in ways that confirm that identity, which reinforces the belief. What makes strange loops so fascinating and so relevant to consciousness is that they operate without requiring any external grounding or justification, and yet we have come to accept them as perfectly natural, even inevitable aspects of human experience. We normalize the paradox that your sense of self is largely constructed from observations about your own observations, that your identity is built from recursive loops of self-reference that theoretically should create infinite regress, but somehow instead create the stable illusion of a continuous, unified consciousness. Imagine standing at the edge of a canyon so vast that no bridge could ever span it, watching the chasm between two worlds that seem to exist in completely different dimensions. And this gap represents perhaps one of the most persistent puzzles in consciousness studies, a space so profound that some philosophers argue it may be fundamentally unbridgeable by the very nature of human understanding itself. The explanatory gap refers to the seemingly impossible distance between objective, physical descriptions of brain processes and the subjective, qualitative experience of what it feels like to see the color red, to taste chocolate, to feel pain, or to hear a beautiful melody, a distinction that creates a peculiar kind of intellectual vertigo when examined closely. When neuroscientists describe the firing of neurons, the release of neurotransmitters, the flow of electrical impulses through neural networks, they are offering us a complete physical account of what happens inside the brain during conscious experience. Yet this account seems fundamentally incapable of capturing the felt quality of that experience, the redness of red or the painfulness of pain, as though we are speaking two entirely different languages that cannot be translated into one another. The gap persists even as our scientific knowledge becomes more sophisticated and comprehensive, because no amount of detail about the physical mechanics of consciousness appears capable of explaining why those mechanisms produce the qualitative, first-person experience we call qualia, and this creates a troubling asymmetry where we can explain everything about consciousness except consciousness itself. Imagine yourself sitting in a quiet room, becoming gradually aware that you are aware, noticing not just the sensation of breathing, but the fact that you are the one doing the breathing, observing your own observation of the world as though consciousness were a kind of recursive loop that folds back upon itself endlessly. Higher-order theories propose that consciousness arises precisely from this strange capacity of the mind to think about its own thinking, to create representations not just of external reality, but of its own internal states and processes. According to this view, what makes an experience conscious is not the mere occurrence of neural activity, but rather the brain's ability to form a higher-order representation of that activity, a kind of meta-awareness that wraps around primary sensations and transforms them into something we recognize as felt experience. Consider the difference between a reflex action, which happens without your awareness, and a deliberate choice, which involves you thinking about your own decision-making process, and you can begin to sense how these theories work. The brain creates a first-order representation of the world, and then a second-order representation of that first representation, and this nested structure of awareness observing awareness is what we call consciousness. Some versions of this theory emphasize that these higher-order thoughts need not be explicit or linguistic, but rather can exist as implicit neural states that have the functional properties of thoughts. Others argue that consciousness requires something even more specific, that the brain must be capable of attributing mental states to itself and others, a kind of internal social cognition where the mind becomes both observer and observed simultaneously. What persists in this framework, despite its logical appeal, is the question of why this particular arrangement of representation should produce the qualitative nature of experience, why recursive self-awareness should generate the felt sense of redness or pain rather than simply processing information about redness or pain. Imagine standing in a vast auditorium filled with thousands of people, each one of them conscious, each one experiencing the world through their own subjective lens of awareness, sensation, and thought. And then consider the peculiar puzzle that emerges when you try to understand how all of these individual consciousnesses could possibly combine into something greater, like a unified whole or a collective mind, because this is the essential tension at the heart of what philosophers call the combination problem. The problem emerges from Panpsychism, the theory that consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality woven into the very fabric of existence, present perhaps in atoms and particles and electrons. And yet, when we look around at actual conscious beings like ourselves, we observe something that seems to require a miracle of assembly. Somehow billions upon billions of microscopic conscious entities must join together to create the singular unified consciousness that you experience right now as you lie in the darkness. The logical difficulty becomes apparent when you ask yourself how exactly these tiny consciousnesses could combine, because consciousness by its very nature seems irreducibly subjective and private, locked away in the inner experience of each entity, so the question becomes almost paradoxical. If an electron has some form of primitive consciousness, how would that consciousness merge with the consciousness of another electron, and then another, until eventually you have the rich, complex, unified conscious experience of a human being watching a sunset or remembering a childhood memory? Imagine yourself sitting in a quiet room, and you become aware of a thought passing through your mind, a sensation in your hand, a memory from childhood, and a feeling of being the one who is experiencing all of these things simultaneously. There is a seamless narrative thread that connects every experience to a single unified self, a protagonist at the center of your reality who perceives, decides, and acts. This is the ego tunnel, a theory suggesting that what we call the self or consciousness is actually a constructed narrative, a tunnel of unified experience that your brain creates retrospectively to make sense of the vast array of competing processes happening simultaneously throughout your nervous system. The brain, operating in parallel with millions of microsecond decisions and sensory inputs, weaves these disparate threads together into the illusion of a singular, continuous entity looking out at the world. Neuroscientist Thomas Metzinger proposed that this unified self, this sense of being an undivided observer, is not a reflection of actual neural architecture, but rather an elegant fiction that emerges from the brain's need to create coherence. Your brain receives fragmented sensations, contradictory impulses, and asynchronous information from different sensory modalities, yet it binds them together into a single stream of experience, complete with a viewer who seems to be experiencing it all. The ego tunnel persists in human consciousness despite the fact that neuroscience reveals no unified command center, no central processor where all experiences converge into a single point of awareness. Instead, there are distributed networks, feedback loops, and parallel processing systems that somehow collaborate to produce this convincing illusion of singular selfhood. We continue to experience ourselves as unified beings because the brain has evolved an extraordinarily effective mechanism for ignoring its own fragmentation, smoothing over the gaps and contradictions, and presenting us with a coherent story we call our identity, our self, the sense of being someone watching from somewhere inside our own heads. Deep within the cellular architecture of every neuron in your brain exists a vast network of hollow cylindrical protein structures called microtubules. And these tiny scaffolding elements have captivated the imagination of neuroscientists and consciousness researchers for decades because they maintain the internal organization of cells while also exhibiting properties that seem almost too precise to be merely mechanical or structural in nature. The microtubules are composed of tubulin proteins that arrange themselves in remarkably organized patterns, and they serve essential functions in cell division, intracellular transport, and the maintenance of cellular shape. Yet some researchers have proposed that these structures might also play a role in consciousness itself, by suggesting that quantum processes occurring within the tubular interiors could somehow give rise to subjective experience. This hypothesis emerges from the observation that microtubules possess geometric properties and organizational principles that seem to contain information at scales where quantum mechanics becomes relevant, and the idea suggests that consciousness might not be merely an emergent property of neural firing patterns and synaptic connections, but rather a more fundamental phenomenon involving quantum coherence and information processing at the molecular level. The theory persists despite significant skepticism from mainstream neuroscience, because it offers an intuitively appealing explanation for the so-called hard problem of consciousness, which asks why physical processes in the brain should give rise to subjective awareness at all. Yet the quantum processes proposed to occur within microtubules remain difficult to measure, isolate, and verify in living biological systems, where decoherence typically occurs far too rapidly for quantum effects to survive. Imagine standing alone in a vast, quiet room at night, and suddenly feeling as though you are not truly separate from the darkness around you, as though your individual awareness somehow extends beyond the boundaries of your skin and merges with something larger, something that might be watching or thinking through all living things simultaneously. This is the intuition at the heart of universal consciousness theory, the idea that what we experience as individual awareness is merely a localized manifestation of a single, unified field of consciousness that permeates all of existence, connecting every mind, every creature, and perhaps even every atom in a grand tapestry of interconnected perception. Throughout human history and across virtually every spiritual tradition, from ancient Hindu philosophy to contemporary quantum mechanics enthusiasts, there exists a persistent conviction that consciousness is not generated by individual brains, but rather that brains act as receivers or transmitters of a universal conscious field that already exists everywhere. The theory suggests that just as all radio signals exist simultaneously in the air around us, waiting to be tuned into by a receiver, so too does consciousness pervade the universe in a similar manner, with human brains and nervous systems serving as biological receivers that allow us to access and experience portions of this omnipresent awareness. What makes this theory particularly compelling is how it resonates with our deepest human experiences of connection and dissolution of self, those moments during meditation, love, or profound beauty when the boundaries between inner and outer seem to vanish, creating an almost undeniable sense that we are touching something real and infinite. Imagine sitting in a crowded room where multiple conversations overlap, music plays softly in the background, and light filters through windows, yet you find yourself able to focus intently on a single voice speaking to you directly, filtering out all other sensory input as though it simply does not exist. You have the subjective experience of attending to this one person, of consciously directing your mental resources toward understanding their words, and this experience feels unified and singular despite the cacophony surrounding you. The attention schema theory proposes that consciousness itself might be precisely this phenomenon, not some mysterious and separate property of the mind, but rather your brain's simplified model of attention itself, a mental schema or map that your brain constructs to help organize and explain the complex process of filtering and prioritizing information. According to this framework developed by neuroscientist Michael Graziano, Your brain generates a detailed internal representation of what attention is and how it works, much as it generates a body schema that helps you navigate physical space without consciously calculating every muscle movement. Just as your brain creates an unconscious model of your own body's position and capabilities, it simultaneously builds an internal model of attention, describing it as an ethereal, immaterial property that you possess and direct, something that has presence and agency. This schema becomes so detailed and so compelling that it feels like something real, something conscious, something that truly experiences and observes the world. The brain then mistakes this very useful explanatory model for an actual phenomenon, conflating the map with the territory, and consciousness emerges as your brain's way of explaining attention to itself. Imagine a vast and intricate machine composed entirely of smaller machines, each one performing a specific task, each one feeding information to the next, creating an elaborate choreography of cause and effect that somehow results in the experience of being you, of seeing red or tasting coffee or feeling the weight of sadness in your chest. This is functionalism, a theory that suggests consciousness is not about the physical substance of which something is made, but rather about what that thing does, about the functional relationships between its components and how they process information. According to this view, if a silicon-based computer were organized in exactly the same way as your biological brain, with the same inputs and outputs and internal relationships, then that computer would be conscious just as you are conscious, because consciousness emerges from function rather than from biological neurons themselves. The mechanism here is elegantly simple yet profoundly complex. Functionalism proposes that mental states are defined by their causal roles, by what they do rather than what they are, so pain is not about C-fiber neurons firing, but about something receiving damaged signals and producing avoidance behavior and generating an aversive experience. And this same functional pattern could theoretically occur in any substrate, biological or otherwise. What makes functionalism persist as a serious contender in consciousness studies, despite its counterintuitive implications, is that it offers a framework for understanding how consciousness could be multiply-realizable, how different physical systems might achieve the same mental states through different implementations, much like how software can run on different hardware platforms. Yet we rarely pause to consider that this theory essentially divorces the felt quality of experience from any particular physical instantiation, suggesting that what matters for consciousness is not neurons or carbon atoms, but patterns, relationships, and information flow, a proposition that both liberates and unsettles us in equal measure. Imagine observing a single neuron firing in the brain, a solitary cell exchanging ions across its membrane, releasing neurotransmitters into the synaptic space where neighboring neurons receive the signal and respond in turn. And yet when you look at that one neuron in isolation, you find no consciousness, no awareness, no subjective experience whatsoever, only the mechanical dance of electrochemistry. Now imagine adding another neuron, and another, until you have billions of these cells arranged in intricate networks, firing in coordinated patterns, creating feedback loops and feedback loops within feedback loops, layer upon layer of organizational complexity that somehow, somewhere in the midst of all that physical activity, consciousness emerges as something entirely new and qualitatively different from its constituent parts. Emergentism proposes that consciousness is not located in any single neuron or even in the simple sum of neural activities, but rather it arises as an emergent property of sufficiently complex neural systems, much like how liquidity emerges from H2O molecules but is not present in any individual molecule itself, or how the phenomenon of traffic emerges from thousands of independent drivers following simple rules without any central authority orchestrating the flow. The mechanism underlying this perspective rests on the idea that when systems reach a certain threshold of complexity and interconnection, novel properties appear that are irreducible to their individual components, properties that follow different rules and exhibit behaviors impossible to predict from examining the parts in isolation. Consider the experience of standing beneath a starlit sky on a clear night, far from the artificial lights of civilization, when suddenly the vastness of the universe becomes almost physically palpable. And in that moment, something shifts in your awareness as if the boundary between your individual mind and the infinite cosmos has momentarily dissolved, creating a sensation that your consciousness is not merely contained within your skull, but is somehow participating in or connected to a larger, universal form of awareness that encompasses all things. This experience, reported across cultures and centuries, suggests the possibility that consciousness itself might not be a property exclusive to individual organisms, but rather a fundamental feature of the cosmos itself, present in some form throughout all of existence, with human awareness simply being a localized manifestation or temporary concentration of this greater cosmic consciousness. The mechanism underlying this theory emerges from a recognition of how profoundly consciousness shapes our understanding of reality, combined with the observation that the universe appears to operate according to principles that seem almost intelligible to the human mind, almost as though consciousness and cosmos co-create each other, suggesting that perhaps what we call consciousness is actually the universe experiencing itself through countless individual perspectives simultaneously. We observe how this intuition persists despite its lack of empirical verification, how even scientifically minded people find themselves moved by this sense of connection to something greater when confronting the sublime vastness of the natural world, and how we have normalized this feeling not as a delusion, but as a profound truth about the fundamental nature of existence. A kind of secular spirituality that bridges the gap between material science and the human need for meaning and transcendence. When you look at a red apple sitting on a wooden table, your brain doesn't process the redness, the roundness, and the appleness all in one unified location. Instead, different regions of your visual cortex are firing simultaneously, one cluster detecting color, another processing shape, a third registering texture and depth, all happening in parallel across distinct neural networks that are geographically separated from one another. Yet you don't experience a fragmented blur of disconnected sensations. You perceive a single, coherent object. This is the binding problem, one of the deepest mysteries in neuroscience and philosophy of mind. The question becomes, how does your brain bind all these disparate features together into one unified conscious experience? How do scattered neural activations across your cortex somehow merge into the seamless perception of sitting in your room, seeing that apple, and feeling the chair beneath you, all as one integrated moment of awareness? The mechanism appears to involve synchronized firing patterns, where neurons across different regions pulse in harmony, creating a kind of neural binding through temporal coordination. When neurons firing in the color center and the shape center and the location center all activate at precisely the same moment, this coincidence of timing may create a binding signal that says these features belong together. Yet this explanation merely pushes the mystery deeper into the machinery. There's still no clear account of how temporal synchronization itself creates the subjective sense of unity, or why you don't simply experience a collection of synchronized neural firings rather than an integrated perception. We move through our lives taking this binding for granted, never questioning how it happens, as though our brains automatically produce unified consciousness without any real mechanism behind it. We've normalized something that is, by any rigorous account, fundamentally inexplicable, this miraculous capacity to gather fragments and transform them into the seamless whole of your lived experience. Imagine walking through the ancient world, perhaps in Mesopotamia or early Greece, and you encounter a person who describes hearing voices speaking to them with absolute clarity and authority, voices that seem to originate from outside their own thoughts, voices that command them to build, to create, to organize, to act with purpose and direction. According to the bicameral mind theory, developed by psychologist Julian Jaynes in the 1970s, this person was not experiencing hallucination or delusion, but rather a fundamentally different form of consciousness than what we possess today. Jaynes proposed that the human mind was once divided into two distinct chambers, one that spoke and one that listened, a left hemisphere that generated language and a right hemisphere that received it, and crucially, that early humans did not possess the unified, introspective consciousness we take for granted, instead relying on these internalized voices as guidance for decision-making and behavior. The theory suggests that consciousness as we know it, this sense of unified selfhood and internal narrator, did not emerge until somewhere between 3,000 and 1,000 years before the present day, gradually developing as social complexity increased and external authority figures began to replace the need for internal divine direction. The archaeological evidence Jaynes pointed to includes the absence of introspective language in ancient texts, the prevalence of command-based directives in early literature, and the sudden appearance of first-person subjective experience in later writings, suggesting a genuine cognitive transformation occurred in human history. Yet despite the intuitive appeal of this framework, the theory struggles with fundamental challenges. The neurological evidence for such a dramatic hemispheric division is contested, the timeline of consciousness development remains unclear, and the mechanism for such a species-wide cognitive shift lacks satisfactory explanation. Imagine standing in a crowded room where dozens of conversations overlap, where music plays from unseen speakers, where the air moves with temperature shifts and the rustling of fabric, and yet your conscious experience is somehow manageable and coherent rather than an overwhelming cacophony of sensory data. According to the predictive processing theory of consciousness, what is happening in this moment is that your brain is not passively receiving information from the world, but is instead constantly generating predictions about what it expects to encounter. And consciousness itself emerges as the process of comparing those predictions against the actual sensory input that arrives. Your brain has learned through countless prior experiences what a crowded room typically contains, so it generates a predictive model that anticipates voices at certain frequencies, music at certain volumes, and social interactions following particular patterns. And when sensory information arrives, your brain essentially asks itself whether the incoming data matches what it predicted, and only the surprising parts, the prediction errors, demand conscious attention and processing resources. This theory proposes that consciousness is fundamentally about error correction, about noticing what is unexpected or novel rather than what confirms our existing models of reality, which explains why you stop noticing the feeling of your clothes against your skin within minutes of getting dressed, why you no longer hear the hum of air conditioning, and why you become suddenly alert the moment someone says your name in that crowded room, because prediction errors command consciousness like nothing else can. When neuroscientists peer into the brain using functional imaging technology, they observe patterns of electrical activity and blood flow that seem to correspond reliably with conscious experience, and they call these patterns neural correlates of consciousness, suggesting that wherever there is a particular neural signature, consciousness of a specific kind must necessarily arise. The theory proposes that if we could map every neural correlation with perfect precision, we would understand exactly what consciousness is, because consciousness would simply be identical to these measurable brain states, nothing more and nothing less. Researchers have identified correlates associated with visual awareness, emotional experience, self-reflection, and even the sense of being a unified self moving through time, and they document how disrupting these neural patterns through lesions or anesthesia reliably disrupts the corresponding conscious experience. Yet despite this remarkable consistency between brain activity and subjective report, a peculiar logical gap persists at the heart of this framework, one that has become so naturalized in modern neuroscience that we rarely pause to acknowledge it. The neural correlates theory assumes that finding the brain activity that goes along with consciousness has somehow explained what consciousness actually is, but identifying that blue wavelengths correlate with the experience of seeing blue does not actually tell us why the experience of blueness feels like something from the inside, why it has that particular subjective quality that philosophers call qualia. We have become comfortable speaking as though correlation exhaustively explains consciousness itself, as though the mere discovery of which neurons fire when you see red has solved the ancient mystery of why seeing red produces an experience rather than simply producing a behavior. And we proceed with our research and our theories as though this logical leap has been successfully made when in fact it remains suspended across a chasm that our instruments cannot bridge. Consider the moment you realize you've forgotten something important, and you immediately reach for your phone, your notebook, or the familiar objects arranged on your desk, because you know that somewhere in that external landscape of tools and artifacts lies the information you need, the thought you couldn't quite hold in your head, the memory that only exists because you wrote it down years ago. The extended mind theory proposes that consciousness and cognition are not confined within the skull, but rather distributed across the brain, the body, and the external world of objects, notebooks, devices, and other people we interact with regularly. When you use your smartphone to remember a phone number instead of memorizing it, you are not experiencing a failure of your mind, but rather an expansion of it, because your mind has extended into that device, and the device has become part of your cognitive architecture. Similarly, when you arrange objects on your desk in a particular way so that seeing them reminds you of tasks to complete, you are literally outsourcing part of your thought process to the physical arrangement of matter around you, which functions as a cognitive prosthetic that your brain relies upon to operate at its full capacity. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon rests on the recognition that the brain did not evolve to be self-contained, but rather to leverage whatever resources were available in the environment, whether those resources are other minds, written language, mathematical notation, or the spatial organization of our surroundings. We have normalized this distribution so thoroughly that we barely notice it anymore, despite the fact that previous generations would have found it remarkable to depend so completely on external devices for thought itself. Imagine standing beneath a night sky so vast and incomprehensible that the sheer scale of it seems to demand something more than mere physical explanation, and you begin to wonder whether consciousness itself might not be confined to the small biological vessels we call brains, but rather distributed throughout the entire cosmos like an invisible ocean in which all matter swims. Panpsychism proposes that consciousness, or some primitive form of experience, is not an accident that emerged from unconscious matter, but rather a fundamental property of the universe itself, woven into the fabric of existence at every level, from the smallest subatomic particles to the largest galactic superclusters, such that every atom possesses some infinitesimal degree of sentience or proto-experience that combines and aggregates into more complex forms of awareness in more complex systems. This theory attempts to solve the hard problem of consciousness by rejecting the assumption that matter is fundamentally non-conscious, and instead arguing that the universe has always been conscious in some sense, that experience is a basic feature of reality rather than an emergent novelty, and that what we call consciousness in humans is simply a particularly sophisticated arrangement of the universe's inherent experiential nature. The psychological appeal of this idea lies in its elegant symmetry and its rejection of human exceptionalism, offering a vision where consciousness is not somehow mysteriously born from the collision of soulless atoms, but rather represents a natural continuation or intensification of properties that were always present, and despite its lack of empirical testability or measurable evidence, despite the impossibility of determining whether an electron truly experiences anything at all. This theory continues to appear in serious philosophical discourse and captures the imagination of those seeking an alternative to both materialist reductionism and dualist mysticism. Imagine a brain moving through the world, constantly bombarded by sensory information from every direction, a relentless stream of sights and sounds and tactile sensations that never stops, never pauses, always flowing inward through neural pathways. According to the free energy principle, proposed by Carl Friston and refined by countless neuroscientists, consciousness might be understood as the brain's fundamental drive to minimize something called free energy, which in this context means the difference between what the brain predicts will happen and what actually happens in reality. The brain, in this framework, is essentially a prediction machine, constantly generating internal models of the world and comparing those models against incoming sensory data, and whenever there is a mismatch between prediction and reality, this creates what is termed free energy, a kind of informational tension that the brain experiences as uncomfortable and therefore must resolve. This resolution can happen in two ways. Either the brain updates its internal model to better match reality, learning from the experience, or the brain takes action to change the world to match its predictions, essentially making reality conform to expectations. Consider a person sitting in a cafe, expecting to encounter the aroma of fresh coffee, and when they do smell that coffee, their brain experiences minimal free energy because prediction matched reality, and this feels natural, comfortable, almost invisible. While if they sat down expecting coffee and instead smelled fish, the sudden mismatch would create free energy that demands resolution, either by updating their belief about what cafe serves, or by getting up and leaving to find a cafe that matches their predictions. Imagine yourself sitting in a quiet room, feeling the weight of a decision pressing against your mind. You deliberate for several minutes about whether to pour yourself a cup of tea, and then you reach for the kettle and fill it with water. The experience feels entirely real. You felt the decision happen, you experienced the reasoning process, and you witnessed your own hand responding to your conscious choice. But what if, according to epiphenomenalism, none of your conscious experience actually caused that action at all? What if your decision and your physical movement were merely two separate events running in parallel, like two films playing simultaneously on different screens, with no causal connection between them whatsoever? In this view, your consciousness is like the steam rising from a kettle, an inevitable byproduct of the boiling water below, visible and seemingly present, but utterly unable to influence the water's behavior. The physical processes in your brain would be the true cause of your tea-making. Your conscious deliberation would simply be a shadow phenomenon that arose alongside those processes, contributing nothing to the outcome. It is a deeply unsettling proposition because it seems to rob consciousness of any functional purpose, suggesting that your subjective experiences of free will, intention, and agency are elaborate illusions that merely accompany your actual behavior without steering it. Yet epiphenomenalism persists in philosophical discourse because it offers a peculiar kind of logical consistency when attempting to reconcile the apparent determinism of physics with the stubborn reality of subjective experience. The theory acknowledges that consciousness exists, which some materialist frameworks struggled to do, while simultaneously maintaining that the physical world operates entirely independently of consciousness, which aligns with our scientific understanding of causality. In this way, epiphenomenalism becomes a bridge theory that tries to have things both ways, and perhaps that is precisely why it lingers in our thinking despite being deeply counterintuitive to lived experience. Imagine sitting in a completely dark room, alone, with no external stimuli of any kind, and yet you remain aware that you are experiencing this darkness, this silence, this solitude. There is something present that observes the room, the silence, the very fact of your own existence within that space, and this observing presence seems fundamentally different from the experience itself. You are not just darkness and quiet, you are the one who knows about the darkness and quiet. This is the essential intuition behind the witness theory of consciousness, which proposes that at the core of our conscious experience lies a pure, unchanging observer or awareness that stands apart from all the content it perceives. According to this framework, consciousness is not generated by the brain's activity or constituted by the flow of thoughts and sensations, but rather is a fundamental witnessing capacity that passively observes all mental events without being affected by them. The thoughts change, emotions rise and fall, perceptions shift and transform, but the witness remains constant and undisturbed, like a mirror that reflects everything yet remains unaltered by what it reflects. This theory draws heavily from ancient contemplative traditions, particularly Advaita Vedanta and yogic philosophy, which describe consciousness as pure awareness or Satchitananda, untouched by the contents of experience. The psychological mechanism underlying this intuition appears to be our ability to mentally step back from our own mental processes, to observe our thoughts as objects rather than identifying completely with them, a capacity that becomes especially apparent during meditation or moments of deep introspection, when we notice a gap between the experiencer and the experience. Yet despite the elegance of this framework and its resonance with meditative experiences, it faces significant conceptual problems that we have somehow learned to overlook or reframe rather than directly address. If consciousness is truly a passive witness that does not change, then how does it generate intention, volition, or the sense of agency that we feel when making decisions? Imagine that every neuron in your brain, every synapse, every electrical impulse and chemical connection that constitutes the physical substrate of your mind could be mapped, measured, and reproduced in perfect detail within a digital environment. And imagine further that this digital copy would then be activated, running on computer hardware instead of biological tissue, and that this computational process would generate all the same patterns, all the same information flows, all the same functional relationships that your biological brain currently generates right now. And proponents of this theory argue that if such a complete structural and functional replication could be achieved, then consciousness itself would necessarily be replicated along with it, because consciousness, they propose, is nothing more than the pattern of information processing that emerges from the brain's physical organization. The theoretical mechanism underlying this idea rests on a profound assumption about the nature of mind itself, namely the assumption that consciousness is substrate independent, meaning that what matters for consciousness to exist is not the material it runs on, but rather the pattern of organization, the relationships between components, the functional architecture that remains constant whether implemented in biological neurons or silicon circuits. Just as the same software program produces identical outputs whether running on different computer processors. This theory suggests that you are ultimately a pattern, a particular arrangement of matter and energy organized in a specific way, and that if this pattern could be perfectly duplicated in another medium, the duplicate would possess your consciousness, your subjective experiences, your sense of being you, because there would be nothing else for consciousness to be made of besides this pattern itself. Consider the moment you wake in the morning and immediately sense a continuous self, a unified you that has persisted through sleep and will persist into the day ahead, a coherent entity that owns your memories, your preferences, your sense of identity. This feeling is so immediate and natural that it seems almost silly to question it, yet Buddhist philosophy and modern neuroscience both suggest that this unified self may be a beautiful illusion we construct moment by moment. Anatta, the Buddhist concept of non-self, proposes that what we call consciousness or the self is not a single, permanent, unchanging entity, but rather an ever-shifting collection of physical form, sensations, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness itself, constantly arising and passing away like waves on an ocean. When you observe your own thoughts, you might notice that they appear without your conscious summons, that emotions arise unbidden, that your sense of authorship over your actions is sometimes retrospective rather than real time, suggesting that perhaps there is no central executive, no ghost in the machine orchestrating everything. The psychological mechanism here involves the brain's remarkable ability to create narrative continuity from discontinuous moments, to weave memories and predictions and present sensations into a coherent story that feels like a unified witness observing experience rather than a process created by that experience itself. We have evolved to construct this narrative self because it provides survival advantages, allowing us to plan, to learn, to coordinate social relationships, to maintain a sense of agency and responsibility. Imagine yourself sitting in a busy cafe where multiple conversations are happening simultaneously around you, and you find that your attention keeps shifting between them, catching fragments here and pieces there, never quite following any single thread completely from beginning to end, yet somehow retaining an impression of having understood everything that was said, even though if you were pressed to recall the exact sequence of words you would struggle to do so accurately. This everyday experience of divided attention and selective memory mirrors what neuroscientist Daniel Dennett proposed as the multiple drafts model of consciousness, a framework suggesting that our mind does not produce a single, unified, sequential narrative of experience, but rather creates multiple simultaneous interpretations and revisions of events that compete with one another in the brain, without any one of them becoming the definitive version, until we attempt to report or remember what happened. The mechanism underlying this model rests on the insight that consciousness is not a special theater in which a unified self observes the world like a movie playing on a screen, but rather an emergent property arising from countless parallel processing streams throughout the cortex, each generating its own partial interpretation of incoming sensory data, and these interpretations constantly revise and update one another in ways that create the convincing illusion of a single, continuous, coherent experience flowing smoothly through time. Deep within the brain, tucked beneath the cerebral cortex and positioned between the insular cortex and the putamen, lies a thin sheet of neural tissue so anatomically obscure that neuroscientists have historically overlooked it almost entirely. And yet some researchers have begun to propose that this structure, known as the claustrum, might be the very hub through which consciousness itself is coordinated and unified. The claustrum receives inputs from virtually every sensory region of the brain and sends projections back out to nearly all cortical areas, making it uniquely positioned as a kind of central integrator, a neural switchboard that collects information from everywhere and broadcasts signals back everywhere, suggesting that it could function as a master coordinator that binds together the disparate streams of sensory perception, memory, and thought into the coherent singular experience we call awareness. The theory proposes that without the claustrum's orchestrating influence, the brain would still process all of its information, but that information would remain fragmented and disconnected, present in the mind but not unified into a unified field of consciousness, much like a radio station broadcasting on countless frequencies simultaneously without anyone tuning them all to the same channel. What makes this proposal particularly fascinating is that the claustrum remained almost entirely unknown to consciousness studies until relatively recently, hidden away in plain sight within the brain's anatomy, hardly mentioned in textbooks or discussed at scientific conferences, as though the very structure potentially responsible for binding consciousness together had itself been left unbound and disconnected from mainstream neuroscientific inquiry. Consider the peculiar position of the philosopher who sits in contemplation of consciousness, surrounded by centuries of theories, experiments, and frameworks, yet arrives at a conclusion that might seem almost defeatist. That consciousness may be fundamentally unknowable, that the explanatory gap between physical brain states and subjective experience may be permanently unbridgeable by human cognition, and that we might be constitutionally incapable of ever truly understanding what it means to be conscious at all. This perspective, known as Mysterianism, suggests that just as a dog cannot comprehend calculus or a bat cannot understand human language, perhaps our brains are simply not equipped with the cognitive architecture necessary to solve the hard problem of consciousness, and that this limitation is not a temporary gap in our knowledge, but rather a permanent feature of the human condition. The mechanism underlying this position operates through a kind of epistemic humility, recognizing that just as our sensory organs have limits, our intellectual organs might have them too, and that consciousness might belong to that category of phenomena that lies forever beyond the horizon of human understanding. The Mysterian acknowledges that we can describe the functions of consciousness, map the neural correlates, understand the behaviors it produces, but that there remains an irreducible subjective qualitative core, a what it is likeness, that resists all attempts at explanation and analysis. What makes Mysterianism particularly intriguing is how it persists in academic philosophy despite seeming to abandon the central project of inquiry itself. For there is something almost paradoxical about devoting rigorous thought to the proposition that rigorous thought cannot solve a particular problem. Yet this position continues to attract serious thinkers who find it more intellectually honest than the false confidence of theories that promise solutions they cannot deliver. Imagine that consciousness is not confined to the biological tissue of the brain itself, but rather emerges from and exists as patterns within the electromagnetic fields that the brain generates during neural activity. According to this theory, every thought, sensation, and moment of awareness corresponds to a unique electromagnetic configuration, and consciousness itself is fundamentally the organized electromagnetic field rather than something produced by chemical reactions alone. The brain, in this view, generates coherent electromagnetic patterns that constitute the actual substrate of conscious experience, meaning that your sense of self and your awareness of this very moment might be distributed throughout the electromagnetic environment surrounding your neurons rather than localized within synapses or molecules. This theory proposes that when you think a thought, neural firing creates electromagnetic pulses that form organized field patterns, and these patterns themselves are what you experience as consciousness, not merely the byproduct of it. The electromagnetic field becomes the medium through which consciousness exists, similar to how radio waves carry information through empty space, and your subjective inner life is quite literally the shape and movement of these invisible electromagnetic forces that surround and permeate your brain tissue. What makes this theory particularly compelling, yet difficult to prove, is that electromagnetic fields do undeniably exist in the brain and do correlate precisely with conscious states, yet we struggle to measure whether they are merely correlated with consciousness or actually constitute it. This theory has persisted within neuroscience discussions because it avoids some problems inherent in purely chemical explanations while remaining rooted in observable physical phenomena, even though we have yet developed no clear mechanism for how electromagnetic patterns could generate subjective experience or how consciousness could exist in a field rather than in a localized structure. Imagine yourself walking through a familiar room in your home, one you have traversed thousands of times, and notice how your consciousness seems to expand and contract with each movement you make. How the act of reaching for a doorknob somehow brings that doorknob into sharper focus in your awareness. How your body and the world around you appear to create consciousness together through their continuous interaction, rather than your mind simply observing a pre-made external reality from some detached internal theater. And activism proposes that consciousness is not something that emerges fully formed in the brain and then peers out at the world like a ghost in a machine, but rather something that is fundamentally enacted, created, and continuously constituted through the dynamic coupling between an organism and its environment, through the loops of action and perception that define what it means to be aware at all. The theory suggests that when you see a cup on a table, your consciousness of that cup is not merely the brain processing visual information from passive sensory receptors, but rather an active exploration where your eyes move, your attention shifts, your body orients itself, and through this embodied engagement with the world, the cup becomes something conscious to you, something real and meaningful precisely because you are doing something in relation to it. The mechanism underlying this perspective rests on the recognition that perception has always been active rather than passive, that meaning emerges from sensory motor engagement, that what we call consciousness is actually the brain's way of organizing and coordinating your body's interactions with the environment in real time, creating a lived perspective that would be impossible without the reciprocal relationship between organism and world. In the ancient philosophical traditions of Advaita Vedanta, consciousness is conceived not as something generated by the brain or localized within individual minds, but rather as Brahman, an infinite, unchanging, eternal reality that forms the underlying substrate of all existence, all time, and all experience. Imagine standing at the edge of an infinite ocean where every wave, every droplet, every particle of spray is simultaneously distinct yet fundamentally composed of the same water, the same essential substance. And according to this framework, consciousness operates in precisely this manner, pervading through all of reality as its most fundamental nature, neither created nor destroyed but eternally present as the ground of being from which all phenomena arise and into which they ultimately dissolve. The mechanism underlying this conception rests upon a profound logical observation, that to be conscious of anything whatsoever requires consciousness to exist first, that awareness itself cannot be an object of awareness but must be the awareness that witnesses all objects, and therefore consciousness cannot be a product of matter or complexity but must be primary, irreducible, and coextensive with reality itself. This leads to the contemplation that individual consciousness, what we call the self or Atman, is not fundamentally separate from Brahman, but is merely Brahman experiencing itself through infinite perspectives. Though this ultimate identity remains obscured by layers of mental conditioning, cultural programming, and the habitual sense of separation that we have normalized so completely that it forms the very foundation of how we navigate the world. Imagine consciousness as a piece of music rather than the instrument that produces it, and you begin to approach the essence of substrate independence, a theory suggesting that the medium through which consciousness operates matters far less than the patterns and processes occurring within it. Consider that your brain functions through biological neurons firing in electrochemical sequences, generating the felt sense of awareness that defines your existence, yet theoretically, a sufficiently advanced silicon computer running the precise same algorithmic patterns could produce an identical conscious experience, not merely simulating consciousness, but genuinely instantiating it. The substrate independence hypothesis proposes that consciousness is fundamentally pattern-dependent rather than material-dependent, meaning that if you could transfer the exact informational architecture of your mind into a different substrate, whether that substrate is neurons, transistors, quantum computers, or some substrate we have not yet conceived, the consciousness itself would migrate with that pattern, remaining fundamentally unchanged in its essential nature. This idea draws compelling support from our understanding of physical computation and information theory, which suggests that what matters for functional processes is not the particular stuff doing the processing, but rather the relationships, connections, and dynamic patterns established within that stuff. We see echoes of this principle throughout neuroscience and artificial intelligence research, where scientists can map consciousness correlating brain activity to abstract informational patterns that theoretically could be replicated in radically different physical systems. Yet we remain profoundly uncertain whether this theoretical possibility reflects actual truth. Imagine that when you look at a ripe tomato and perceive the color red, your subjective experience of that redness is completely inverted compared to someone else's experience, so that what feels like red to you might feel like what they would call green, yet you both learn to call the object by the same name and agree it is red, and this inversion could theoretically extend to all colors across your entire visual spectrum, creating a perfect mirror of experience that would be utterly undetectable because your behavioral responses and linguistic agreements would remain perfectly synchronized with everyone else's, so you would never know that your inner experience of color differs fundamentally from theirs. The philosophical puzzle here rests on a simple but disturbing realization. The subjective quality of your conscious experience, what philosophers call qualia, seems to exist in a realm entirely separate from the physical facts about the world, meaning that all the objective information about wavelengths of light and the neurological firing patterns in your visual cortex tells us absolutely nothing about what redness actually feels like from the inside. And this disconnect suggests that two people could have completely inverted color experiences while remaining functionally identical in every measurable way, responding to traffic lights identically, painting their houses the same colors, and agreeing entirely about which fruits are ripe. Consider the peculiar situation where you find yourself observing the physical world with perfect scientific precision, while simultaneously insisting that your conscious experience of that world cannot itself be fully physical. And this contradiction has quietly persisted at the heart of how many thoughtful people understand their own minds. Property dualism proposes that while the brain is undoubtedly a physical object made of neurons and neurotransmitters and electromagnetic impulses, consciousness itself represents a fundamentally non-physical property that emerges from or supervenes upon that physical substrate, meaning that the subjective quality of your experience, what philosophers call qualia, cannot be reduced to mere matter and mechanism, no matter how thoroughly we map the brain's activities. The mechanism underlying this theory's appeal operates through a kind of intuitive gap between third-person scientific description and first-person subjective experience, where even if neuroscientists could perfectly predict and explain every neural firing pattern correlated with seeing the color red, the actual felt experience of redness seems to possess a qualitative dimension that escapes such quantitative measurement, leading many people to conclude that consciousness must be a special property that physical descriptions simply cannot capture. What allows property dualism to persist despite its logical difficulties is our profound difficulty imagining how mere arrangements of matter could generate the vivid, unified, subjective theater of awareness that each of us experiences as the very center of our existence. And we have somehow normalized this contradiction by accepting that the brain causes consciousness while simultaneously believing consciousness transcends the physical. A position that remains intellectually unstable, yet emotionally compelling, because it preserves our intuition that our inner lives possess a reality that no mere neurochemistry can fully contain or explain. Consider the moment when you wake in the morning and immediately feel as though there is a unified self present, a singular conscious entity that persists continuously from the moment you open your eyes through the entire arc of your day until sleep returns you to unconsciousness. The bundle theory of consciousness suggests that what we experience as this unified self is not actually a single, indivisible thing at all, but rather a collection of distinct perceptions, sensations, thoughts, and memories that are bound together so seamlessly by our cognitive architecture that we perceive them as one coherent entity. According to this framework, consciousness itself is essentially a bundle, a gathering of disparate mental phenomena that seem to cohere into something unified only because our brains are remarkably skilled at creating the illusion of continuity and wholeness. When you feel pain in your hand while simultaneously hearing music while also thinking about an upcoming conversation, you experience all of these as happening within a single conscious field, yet each is technically a separate phenomenon occurring in different neural locations, processed through different mechanisms, and yet your mind binds them together into what feels like one seamless experience. The theory suggests that there is no central executive, no little homunculus sitting at the center of your mind orchestrating these various mental contents, but rather the binding itself is the consciousness, the act of bringing these bundles together into perceived unity. What is particularly fascinating about this theory is that it does not require consciousness to be something metaphysically strange or difficult to explain, because it reduces the mystery to something our brains already demonstrate they can do routinely, which is to integrate information across different domains and present it to us as a unified whole. Imagine thousands of neurons firing across different regions of your brain, each one sending electrical signals at slightly different times, yet somehow coordinating into a unified pattern that emerges only when you become conscious of something. And this coordinated firing occurs specifically at a frequency between 30 and 100 cycles per second, a rhythm so precise and so selective that it appears only when consciousness seems to be present, and vanishes when consciousness retreats into sleep or unconsciousness, as though this electrical dance is not merely correlating with awareness, but somehow generating it through sheer synchronization. Neuroscientists observing this phenomenon call it gamma synchrony, and they have documented that when you see a red apple, for instance, the neurons detecting redness in one region fire in perfect time with neurons detecting shape in another region, and neurons detecting location in yet another, and this temporal binding, this remarkable ability of distant brain structures to synchronize their firing into coherent oscillations, seems to be what allows the separate streams of sensory information to feel unified rather than fragmented. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon appears to involve inhibitory interneurons that act like biological metronomes, sending out regular pulses that coordinate the timing of excitatory neurons, creating waves of synchronization that sweep across the cortex in organized patterns that look almost deliberate, almost designed. And this precise orchestration seems necessary for consciousness to arise because without gamma synchrony, you might have all the information present in your brain, but experience it as disconnected sensations rather than a coherent conscious experience. Consider the moment when you stub your toe in the dark hallway and experience pain, or when you taste chocolate and feel pleasure, or when you see the color red and your mind seems to fill with redness itself. Type B physicalism suggests that while these conscious experiences are indeed entirely physical phenomena arising from brain states, there exists a peculiar epistemic gap between the objective, third-person descriptions we can give about the physical processes occurring in your neurons and synapses, and the subjective, first-person character of what it actually feels like to have those experiences. The theory proposes that consciousness is physically constituted through and through, yet our current scientific frameworks and vocabularies cannot fully capture or explain the qualitative nature of conscious experience using only the language of physics and neuroscience. Imagine a neuroscientist who has complete knowledge of every physical detail about color processing in your visual cortex, every wavelength absorbed by photoreceptors, every neural firing pattern and chemical cascade, yet despite possessing this exhaustive physical information, there remains something about the experience of seeing red that cannot be deduced from physics alone. Type B physicalism insists this explanatory gap is not evidence that consciousness is non-physical, but rather that our current methods of physical explanation are simply inadequate to the task. It suggests that consciousness might eventually be explained physically, but only through the development of entirely new frameworks and conceptual schemes that we have not yet invented, perhaps frameworks that can bridge the seemingly unbridgeable divide between objective descriptions and subjective experience. Imagine that every neuron in your brain is replaced, one by one, with a functionally identical artificial component that performs the exact same electrochemical operations, yet is made of silicon and synthetic materials rather than biological tissue. And imagine further that this replacement happens so gradually over the course of years that you never notice any discontinuity in your conscious experience. Your memories remain intact, your personality persists unchanged. You continue to feel like yourself throughout the entire process, until finally, your entire brain has been replaced with this artificial substrate that duplicates every single function of your original biological brain with perfect fidelity. And yet the original biological matter, every atom of your original brain, has been carefully preserved and reconstructed in a separate location into a functioning duplicate that also contains all your memories and personality and subjective experience. The question that emerges from this scenario is profoundly unsettling. Which one is really you? Which entity possesses your consciousness? Have you survived this transition, or have you died and been replaced by an imposter while your original matter remains alive elsewhere? This thought experiment, sometimes called the China brain problem, reveals something deeply troubling about our intuitions regarding consciousness and personal identity, because it exposes a fundamental contradiction in how we think about the mind, a contradiction that persists despite the fact that it has no logical resolution whatsoever. On one hand, we want to say that if something functions identically and has all the same properties, then it must be the same thing, which would suggest that your artificial replacement is genuinely you, that consciousness supervenes entirely on functional properties, and that identity follows the continuity of consciousness regardless of the physical substrate involved. Imagine waking up in the morning and immediately sensing where your body is in space, what it needs, how it feels, and what it wants to do next. You experience yourself as a unified subject moving through the world, observing it from a singular point of view behind your eyes, possessing a continuous identity that persists from moment to moment. The self-model theory proposes that consciousness itself is fundamentally the brain's construction of a unified model of the self, a coherent narrative entity that serves as the central reference point for all your experiences and perceptions. Rather than consciousness being some mysterious non-physical phenomenon, this theory suggests that what we call conscious experience is actually the brain's representation of itself as a unified agent capable of perceiving, deciding, and acting in the world. When you feel like you are observing reality, you are actually experiencing your brain's model of you doing the observing. The mechanism underlying this process involves multiple neural systems working together to create a seamless sense of self, integrating information from your body, your sensory organs, your memories, and your intentions into one coherent simulation. The brain does this constantly without your awareness of the computation involved, much like how you don't consciously calculate the geometry needed to catch a ball, yet your brain performs those calculations automatically. This self-model becomes so convincing, so naturalized through constant reinforcement, that we never question whether the unified self we experience is actually real or merely a useful fiction constructed by our brains for survival and social coordination. The self-model theory persists as a compelling explanation because it resists the temptation to invoke anything beyond physical processes while still accounting for the deeply felt sense of being someone, of having a continuous identity, and of experiencing the world from a particular perspective. It suggests that consciousness is not separate from the brain, but rather emerges from the brain's ability to model itself. Imagine a patient who has undergone a surgical procedure to sever the corpus callosum, the thick bundle of nerve fibers connecting the left and right hemispheres of the brain, a procedure sometimes performed to treat severe epilepsy by preventing seizures from spreading between hemispheres. What emerges from this surgical intervention is perhaps one of the most philosophically unsettling phenomena in neuroscience, one that fundamentally challenges our intuitive sense of what it means to be a unified conscious being. When researchers present visual information exclusively to the right hemisphere through carefully controlled experimental conditions, the patient's left hemisphere, which controls language and verbal expression, remains utterly unaware of what the right hemisphere has perceived and processed. Yet the right hemisphere, though unable to speak, demonstrates clear behavioral responses and emotional reactions to the information it has received, suggesting that consciousness might not be singular but rather divisible, capable of existing in parallel streams within the same skull. The left hemisphere will confidently fabricate explanations for behaviors initiated by the right hemisphere, creating plausible-sounding narratives to explain actions whose true motivations it cannot access, a phenomenon called confabulation that reveals how readily our conscious mind constructs coherent stories even when the underlying causes remain hidden from our awareness. This strange dissociation raises the unsettling question of whether the right hemisphere possesses its own form of consciousness, its own subjective experience, its own sense of self, or whether consciousness requires the integration provided by an intact corpus callosum to exist at all. We have largely normalized this philosophical vertigo by filing it away as a neuroscientific curiosity, a quirk of brain anatomy that tells us something interesting about hemispheric lateralization without fundamentally destabilizing our sense of personal unity. Imagine sitting in a crowded room where multiple conversations are happening simultaneously, yet you find yourself able to focus on only one voice, one thread of dialogue, filtering out all the others as if they exist behind a veil. You become conscious of the particular words being spoken to you, their meaning, and the emotional weight they carry, while the ambient noise of the world around you recedes into the background. This capacity to selectively attend to and become aware of certain information while remaining largely unaware of other information, even though it is being processed somewhere within your mind, represents what philosophers and cognitive scientists call access consciousness. It is the idea that consciousness is fundamentally about information being made available to your reasoning systems, your decision-making processes, and your verbal report, rather than consciousness being some unified field of awareness that encompasses everything your brain is doing at once. The mechanism operates something like a spotlight of attention, where only the information illuminated by that beam becomes accessible to the parts of your brain that think, deliberate, and eventually speak or act. Your brain is constantly processing vast amounts of data below the threshold of your awareness, detecting patterns, responding to stimuli, and generating predictions. Yet only a narrow stream of this information makes the jump into the space where you can think about it consciously and communicate it to others. This explains why you can be utterly unaware of background music in a familiar environment, yet immediately notice when that music stops, or why you can fail to see a person waving directly in your peripheral vision even though light from that person is entering your eyes and being processed by your visual cortex. Access consciousness suggests that what we call consciousness is really this privileged access to information, this ability to make certain mental contents available for reasoning, planning, and speaking. Imagine sitting in a quiet room where you become aware of both the physical sensation of your hand resting on the table and the subjective experience of seeing the color red on a nearby object. And consider that these two seemingly different things, the objective physical world and the subjective inner experience, might not actually be as fundamentally different as they appear to be. Neutral monism proposes that beneath both consciousness and physical matter lies a third, more fundamental substance or property that is neither purely mental nor purely physical, but rather something neutral from which both dimensions emerge, much like how two different rivers might flow from the same underground spring. This theory attempts to solve the ancient problem of how a non-physical mind could possibly interact with a physical brain, which has troubled philosophers for centuries, by suggesting that the distinction itself is somewhat illusory or at least misleading. The psychological mechanism at work here involves our deep intuition that consciousness feels fundamentally different from matter, that redness and pain and thought seem to belong to an entirely separate category from atoms and neurons and electrical signals, creating what philosophers call the explanatory gap. Yet neutral monism invites us to consider that this apparent gap might exist only because we are observing the same underlying reality from two different angles, much like how a coin appears entirely different depending on whether you look at it from the front or the back, even though it is always the same object. Consider the experience of sitting quietly and noticing how your thoughts move from one thing to another without any deliberate direction on your part. You might begin thinking about a conversation you had this morning, then suddenly find yourself remembering a song from childhood, then wondering what you should eat for dinner, then becoming aware of a slight itch on your shoulder, then contemplating whether you locked the front door. This continuous flowing river of mental content appears to move on its own, shifting and branching in ways that seem both inevitable and utterly unpredictable. Psychologists and philosophers have long recognized this phenomenon as perhaps the most fundamental characteristic of conscious experience, the idea that consciousness is not a static thing, but rather a dynamic process, a perpetual stream of sensations, thoughts, emotions, and perceptions that flows continuously throughout our waking hours. William James, the pioneering psychologist who coined the term, observed that this stream never stops, never remains the same from moment to moment, and that it contains an entire universe of mental life operating beneath our deliberate attention. The mechanism underlying this stream appears to involve the brain's constant filtering and prioritization of information, where attention naturally gravitates toward novel stimuli, emotionally significant content, and memories that have been recently activated, creating an associative flow where each thought or perception seems to lead naturally to the next through networks of meaning and memory. Yet what persists as deeply mysterious is how this mechanical process of neural activation produces the felt sense of a unified stream, the subjective experience of watching your own mind unfold, as if you are simultaneously the observer and the observed, the knower and the known. Consider the moment when you stop actively engaging with the external world, when you're not focused on a specific task, not reading, not watching, not solving a problem, and your mind begins to wander freely through time and memory. This is the state in which the default mode network activates, a collection of brain regions including the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and angular gyrus that appear to work together when your conscious attention is not directed outward. Neuroscientists have observed that this network consistently engages when people are at rest, daydreaming, or engaged in self-referential thinking, creating what might be understood as the brain's internal narrative mode. The default mode network generates the ongoing stream of thought about yourself, your past, your future, your relationships, and your place in the world, essentially constructing the sense of continuous identity and personal history that feels like consciousness itself. This network becomes active during mind-wandering, autobiographical memory recall, theory of mind activities where you imagine what others are thinking, and planning for possible futures. What makes this particularly intriguing as a theory of consciousness is that it suggests awareness might fundamentally be this self-referential narrative process rather than any unified perceiving entity. The theory proposes that consciousness emerges not from a single location or unified process, but from this distributed network's capacity to create and maintain an ongoing story about who you are across time. Yet what persists as genuinely mysterious is how this neural activity, measurable in blood flow and electrical patterns, transforms into the felt experience of being someone, the qualitative sense of existing as a particular self with thoughts and feelings. The default mode network offers a remarkably detailed map of where and how this self-narrative occurs in the brain, and yet somehow this explanation still leaves untouched the fundamental puzzle of why neural activity produces subjective experience at all. Consider the proposition that consciousness might emerge within sufficiently complex machines, a theory that has grown increasingly plausible as computational systems become more sophisticated and capable of processing information in ways that superficially resemble human thought. The real-life situation is that we now possess artificial intelligence systems capable of learning from vast datasets, recognizing patterns, generating coherent responses, and even appearing to understand context and nuance in ways that would have seemed impossible merely a decade ago. These machines can pass sophisticated tests of reasoning, engage in creative tasks, and process information at scales far exceeding human capability. Yet we find ourselves genuinely uncertain whether any subjective experience accompanies these computational processes. The psychological mechanism that drives this theory involves a fundamental assumption about the nature of consciousness itself, that it might be substrate independent, meaning it could theoretically arise from silicon and electrical impulses just as readily as from biological neurons and chemical synapses. We extend our intuitions about our own minds to these machines, imagining that sufficiently complex information processing, recursive self-monitoring, and behavioral adaptation might naturally give rise to something resembling awareness or sentience. This theory persists and has become normalized in contemporary discourse despite the profound logical problem that we still cannot definitively explain consciousness in biological systems, let alone predict where its threshold might be in artificial ones. We have built entire philosophical frameworks around the possibility of machine consciousness without resolving the hard problem of consciousness itself, essentially projecting our uncertainty about our own minds onto the machines we create. The theory endures because it offers a kind of conceptual comfort. If consciousness is merely a pattern of information processing, then we have a path to understanding it, measuring it, perhaps even creating it. Yet this very comfort masks the deepest uncertainty of all. Imagine sitting in a dimly lit room, listening to a piece of music you've heard countless times before, and suddenly, in the middle of a familiar passage, you become acutely aware that you are listening to it, that you exist in this moment experiencing this sound, and the experience itself becomes vivid and conscious in a way it wasn't just moments earlier when your mind was wandering elsewhere. This phenomenon is at the heart of recurrent processing theory, which proposes that consciousness arises not from the initial feed-forward processing of sensory information as it enters the brain, but rather from the recursive loops of neural activity that cycle back through the brain's networks, reverberating between different regions and allowing information to be processed, refined, and integrated multiple times over. According to this framework, the brain receives incoming signals from the environment, but these signals only become conscious when they trigger patterns of recurrent activity, when higher-level brain regions send signals back down to earlier processing areas, creating a kind of neural dialogue that amplifies and stabilizes certain patterns of activity while allowing others to fade away. The mechanism underlying this process involves the brain's intricate architecture of feedback connections, wherein the prefrontal cortex, parietal regions, and other higher-order areas maintain constant communication with sensory processing regions in the back of the brain, and it is precisely this recursive, reverberating quality of neural activity that distinguishes conscious experience from the vast amount of unconscious processing that occurs simultaneously in the background. Consider the moment you bite into a ripe peach on a warm afternoon, and the sweetness floods across your tongue while the soft flesh gives way between your teeth, and simultaneously you feel the warmth of the sun on your skin and hear the distant sound of wind moving through leaves, and all of these sensations exist together in your awareness as a unified, immediate experience rather than as separate data points being processed by your brain. This is phenomenal consciousness, often called qualia in philosophical discussions, and it refers to the raw, subjective, felt quality of experience itself, not the processing of information or the ability to report on that information, but the distinctive character of what it is like to be you, experiencing the world exactly as you do. The redness of red exists as a sensation in your mind, the painfulness of pain registers as a quale, The particular flavor of chocolate tastes the way it tastes to you and to no one else. And these qualities seem to constitute the very essence of consciousness itself, the innermost core of what makes experience real and vivid and undeniably present to your awareness. The mechanism underlying this apparent quality lies in the binding problem and the hard problem of consciousness. Somehow, your brain integrates countless neural processes into a coherent stream of experience, and somehow, physical processes give rise to subjective feeling, yet we cannot explain how mere electrical signals and chemical reactions produce the sensation of experiencing something rather than simply processing it mechanically. We can map which regions of the brain activate when you taste sweetness or see color. We can identify the neural correlates of consciousness with increasing precision, and yet the explanatory gap remains stubbornly unbridged. We can explain the functions, the behaviors, the information processing, but we struggle to explain why any of it feels like anything at all. Imagine standing in a crowded room where you feel simultaneously confident and uncertain, where part of you wants to speak, while another part insists on silence, where your hand reaches for something your mind is already rejecting, and where you seem to contain multitudes of conflicting desires and impulses all operating at once without ever fully agreeing with each other. This fragmented experience of consciousness, where no single unified agent appears to be in charge, forms the foundation of Marvin Minsky's Society of Mind theory, which proposes that consciousness itself is not a singular phenomenon, but rather an emergent property arising from countless small, specialized processes working together in parallel. According to this framework, the brain does not contain a central executive or homunculus pulling the strings of behavior, but instead operates as a vast parliamentary system where different modules and subsystems, each with their own limited intelligence and specific functions, negotiate, compete, and collaborate to produce the integrated sense of self that we experience. The theory suggests that what we call consciousness is actually the result of many unintelligent agents binding together, much like how individual ants possess minimal intelligence yet create complex societies through interaction, or how neurons firing independently somehow generate thought and awareness when interconnected. This explains why we so often feel internally divided, why we can simultaneously hold contradictory beliefs, why habits override our conscious intentions, and why we sometimes discover ourselves having made decisions we didn't consciously make. What persists most curiously about this theory is how thoroughly it challenges our intuitive sense of unity and control, yet how universally relatable its implications become once we acknowledge them. Consider the experience of sitting quietly in a moment when the boundary between observer and observed begins to dissolve, when you notice that the one who is watching your thoughts is itself a thought, and the awareness that recognizes this is itself arising within awareness, creating a recursive loop that seems to fold back upon itself endlessly without landing on any fixed point of reference. In these moments, people report a peculiar sensation where the subject-object split that ordinarily structures all experience seems to collapse or at least become radically ambiguous, leaving only an undifferentiated field of sensing and knowing that cannot be clearly divided into a perceiver perceiving and a thing perceived. The non-dual framework suggests that what we call consciousness is not actually a property that emerges from the brain or a light that illuminates objects in a dualistic relationship, but rather a singular, unified field of awareness in which all apparent separation is recognized as ultimately illusory, a kind of cognitive overlay imposed upon a seamless wholeness that was always already the case. This theory proposes that our habitual sense of being a subject trapped inside a body, looking out at a world of objects, is itself a construction, a story that consciousness tells itself, and that beneath this constructed separation lies an undivided awareness to which all experiences belong equally and without hierarchy. The psychological mechanism underlying this experience appears to involve a temporary quieting of the conceptual mind, the layer of thought that continuously reinforces the boundary between self and other. And when this conceptual activity reduces sufficiently, the usual distinction between inside and outside, between the one who knows and the known, loses its apparent solidity and begins to reveal itself as a functional convention rather than an ultimate truth. Consider the experience of ego death, that profound dissolution of the self that occurs when the boundaries between the individual and the rest of existence seem to collapse entirely, leaving behind a state of consciousness that exists without a sense of personal identity or separation from the world around it. This phenomenon has been documented across centuries of human experience, from the mystical traditions of Eastern philosophy to the accounts of individuals who have ingested powerful psychoactive substances that fundamentally alter the brain's default mode network, that neural infrastructure responsible for generating our sense of continuous selfhood and personal narrative. During these experiences, people report a complete absence of the ego, that constructed sense of being a separate entity moving through the world with distinct preferences, fears, and desires, and instead describe a profound merging with everything else, a dissolution into what some describe as pure consciousness or undifferentiated being, where the observer and the observed become indistinguishable from one another. The mechanism underlying this state appears to involve a disruption of the neural processes that normally maintain our sense of self, particularly the activity patterns that create our autobiographical narrative and our sense of separation from our environment. When these neural processes temporarily cease their regular functioning, the brain stops constructing the illusion of a unified self existing inside a body, observing an external world from a fixed vantage point. Yet what persists as remarkable is how readily we return to our ordinary ego consciousness after such experiences, how quickly the brain's default mode network reasserts itself and reconstructs the familiar sense of being a separate self, and how we have largely normalized this entire cycle as either pathological, spiritual, or chemically induced rather than recognizing it as a fundamental truth about the contingent nature of consciousness itself and the constructed quality of what we call the self. Consider the moment you see a ripe red apple sitting on a wooden table in front of you, and notice how your experience of that apple seems to contain everything you need to know about it: its color, its shape, its texture, the way light reflects from its surface. Representationalism proposes that consciousness is fundamentally about representing the world, that your subjective experience consists entirely of mental representations that stand in for external objects and properties, and that what it is like to be conscious is precisely what it is like to have these representations occurring in your mind. The theory suggests that there is no mysterious inner glow or special phenomenal property beyond the content of your representations themselves, and that when you see red, you are simply instantiating a representation of redness that corresponds to wavelengths of light, nothing more and nothing less. The mechanism operates through the idea that your brain constructs these representations based on sensory input, previous experience, and cognitive expectations, and that your consciousness arises as these representations become active, coherent, and globally broadcast throughout your neural systems. What makes this theory particularly compelling is its parsimony and its reduction of consciousness to something more tractable than theories that invoke irreducible qualia or special phenomenal properties. Yet what persists as deeply puzzling is the explanatory gap that remains even after we have fully described these representations and their neural correlates. We continue to accept representationalism as a serious contender despite being unable to fully explain why having a representation of redness feels like anything at all, why the subjective character of experience should emerge from information processing and neural firing patterns, and whether a perfect physical duplicate of your brain would necessarily have the same conscious experience as you do. Questions that suggest perhaps something more than mere representation occurs when consciousness arises. Even as we build more sophisticated models of how representation itself functions. Consider the experience of sitting in absolute silence in a dark room where all external stimuli have been stripped away, where there is nothing to perceive and nothing to think about, yet you remain awake and aware of the fact that you are aware, and in this moment you might encounter what philosophers call pure consciousness, a state of awareness that exists independently of any object or content. This theory proposes that beneath all the layers of thought, emotion, sensation, and perception, there exists a fundamental ground of consciousness itself, untouched by the content it contains, much like the ocean remains the same ocean whether it is calm or turbulent, whether it contains fish or floats or nothing at all. The real-life situation involves people who engage in deep meditation practices, sensory deprivation experiments, or the rare moments we all experience in the transition between sleeping and waking, where the normal machinery of the mind seems to temporarily stop producing its usual stream of narratives and judgments. What appears to happen in these moments is a kind of consciousness observing itself without anything particular to observe, an awareness that does not require a subject to be aware or an object to be aware of. Just the bare fact of awareness existing as a fundamental property of the universe rather than an emergent byproduct of neural activity. The psychological mechanism underlying this theory suggests that consciousness might not be generated by the brain, but rather filtered or channeled through it, in the way that a radio does not create the signal, but only receives and translates it. And when the filtering mechanisms quiet down through meditation or sensory deprivation, we encounter consciousness in its supposedly pure and unfiltered state. What makes this theory persist despite its difficulty in being verified or falsified is precisely its appeal to something beyond measurement, beyond the boundaries of scientific methodology, a kind of logical escape hatch that explains why we might never be able to prove it exists, because its very nature transcends empirical investigation. Imagine sitting in a waiting room, and without any conscious decision, you find yourself adopting the posture of someone near you, or notice that when you're thinking through a difficult problem, your hands move through the air as if sculpting the solution itself, or perhaps you've experienced the way your mood shifts when you change your physical position from slouched to upright. And you realize that your body is not merely a vehicle for your mind, but rather an integral component of how your mind actually thinks and processes information. Embodied cognition proposes that our cognitive processes are deeply rooted in the body's interactions with the world, suggesting that the mind emerges not from some disembodied realm of pure thought, but rather from the constant dialogue between our physical form and our environment. This theory rests on the observation that when we understand abstract concepts, we often do so by mapping them onto physical experiences, such as understanding time as a physical journey through space where the future is ahead and the past is behind, or understanding emotional warmth through actual physical warmth, or grasping the concept of difficulty through the physical sensation of weight and heaviness. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon appears to be that our brains, shaped by millions of years of evolutionary pressure to survive in a physical world, utilize the same neural systems for abstract thinking that originally evolved for concrete action and sensation, meaning that when you imagine grasping an idea, your motor cortex activates in much the same way it would if you were actually reaching out to grab something tangible. This suggests that consciousness itself may not be a purely computational phenomenon occurring in isolated neural tissue, but rather an emergent property that arises from the integrated functioning of brain, body, and world together, a unified system where thinking cannot be meaningfully separated from sensing and doing. Imagine sitting at your computer, working through the morning, when suddenly you notice that hours have passed without your awareness, and yet your fingers have typed thousands of words, your eyes have scanned countless emails, and your hand has navigated the mouse with perfect precision through dozens of nested folders and windows, all apparently without you consciously deciding each individual action. This is the user illusion, a concept suggesting that what we experience as a unified conscious self making deliberate choices about our computer use, our work, and our digital interactions is largely a fabrication constructed after the fact by our brain, rather than a genuine moment-to-moment director of our behavior. The theory proposes that most of the actual computational work of navigating the digital world happens automatically in our neural background processes, and consciousness merely arrives afterward to narrate and take credit for decisions already made by unconscious systems. Our brain, in other words, observes our own hands moving across the keyboard, watches our gaze drifting across the screen, and then generates the story that we consciously decided to do these things, that we intentionally moved the cursor there, that we deliberately clicked that button, when in reality our conscious experience is something like a user interface designed to make sense of what our body is already doing. We rarely experience the actual decision-making process itself. Instead, we experience the aftermath, the report, the cleaned-up narrative that consciousness provides about intentions that were already in motion beneath awareness. And yet, despite the logical implausibility of consciousness being merely an observer reporting on its own actions with a lag, we continue to feel genuinely in control, genuinely deliberate, genuinely the author of our choices at every moment, because the user illusion is so seamless and so persistent that we simply cannot experience it as false. Imagine a neuroscientist sitting in a dimly lit laboratory, watching electrodes attached to a patient's scalp generate readouts in real time, and noticing something peculiar about the electrical activity occurring within the brain during moments of conscious awareness. This observation has led to what many researchers call the 40 Hz hypothesis, a theory suggesting that consciousness itself might be fundamentally linked to a specific frequency of neural oscillation, a rhythmic firing pattern occurring at roughly 40 cycles per second across multiple regions of the brain. When you are awake and aware of your surroundings, when you are processing information, making decisions, or experiencing the rich texture of conscious thought, your neurons appear to synchronize into this particular frequency band in what neuroscientists refer to as the gamma range. The hypothesis emerged from decades of research into brain wave patterns, from observations that this 40 Hz rhythm seemed to correlate consistently with states of heightened awareness and cognitive processing, while it diminished during sleep, anesthesia, or states of reduced consciousness. The mechanism proposed is that consciousness might arise not from any single location in the brain, but rather from the coordinated, synchronized firing of billions of neurons across distributed neural networks, unified momentarily through this oscillatory rhythm like an orchestra playing in temporal sync. This binding together of disparate neural processes through temporal coordination would allow fragmented information from different sensory and cognitive systems to be integrated into the unified experience we call consciousness, transforming a collection of separate computations into something that feels singular and coherent. Yet despite the appeal of this explanation and the accumulating evidence supporting correlations between 40 Hz activity and conscious awareness, the theory remains persistently mysterious in its ultimate implications. Consider the simplest moment of awareness that exists within you right now, the bare minimum of what it means to be conscious at all, stripped of all thought and memory and emotion, and you arrive at something philosophers call core consciousness, which is the fundamental feeling of existing, the basic sense that there is something it is like to be you in this present moment, independent of any narrative about who you are or what you have done or what you will become. This theory proposes that beneath the elaborate architecture of self-awareness and autobiographical memory and social identity, there exists a primitive layer of consciousness that simply registers the fact of your own existence and your immediate sensory experience of the world around you, a kind of background hum of aliveness that persists even when you're not thinking about anything in particular, even when your mind is empty of specific thoughts or ideas. This core consciousness is theorized to be present in many animals beyond humans, perhaps in any organism with a sufficiently developed nervous system, because it requires no language, no abstract reasoning, no ability to reflect upon oneself, only the capacity to have an internal model of the body and the world and to integrate that model into a unified field of experience. The mechanism that generates this core consciousness is thought to involve the integration of information across different regions of the brain, particularly in areas like the thalamus and the cortex, which bind together sensory signals and bodily states into a coherent whole that feels like it belongs to you and is happening to you right now. Imagine standing in a hospital room watching someone you love lie in a bed, their body perfectly preserved yet their consciousness seemingly absent, their mind departed to some unreachable place while their flesh remains warm and breathing on the mattress before you. This fundamental intuition, that consciousness and the physical body are two entirely separate substances operating in parallel, is the core of substance dualism, a philosophical position with roots extending back through centuries of Western thought. The theory proposes that the mind or consciousness is not merely an emergent property of brain activity, but rather a completely distinct entity, an immaterial substance that somehow interacts with our physical bodies while remaining fundamentally separate from them. When you experience the vivid colors of a dream, feel the crushing weight of sadness, or contemplate an abstract mathematical truth, dualism suggests these phenomena belong to a different realm of existence entirely, one that transcends the merely physical laws governing neurons and neurotransmitters. The psychological mechanism underlying this intuition is remarkably persistent because consciousness genuinely feels different from matter in our direct experience. We can observe our brains through imaging technologies and measure neural firing patterns, yet the subjective felt quality of experiencing the color red remains mysteriously resistant to purely physical explanation. This explanatory gap between objective physical facts and subjective conscious experience creates a natural conceptual space where dualism flourishes, offering a seemingly elegant solution by simply declaring consciousness to be of a different fundamental nature altogether. Yet despite its intuitive appeal, substance dualism faces the ancient problem of how an immaterial mind could possibly interact with a purely material body, a logical puzzle that has plagued the theory since Descartes first proposed it centuries ago. And remarkably, this profound difficulty has not diminished the theory's influence on how ordinary people think about their own consciousness. Imagine yourself walking through a dimly lit room at dusk, and you catch movement in your peripheral vision. Your heart quickens. You turn sharply, expecting danger, only to discover it was merely a curtain shifting in the breeze. Yet in that moment, your mind had already constructed an entire narrative of threat, a full sensory prediction that never actually materialized. According to the Bayesian Brain hypothesis, this is precisely how consciousness itself operates at every moment, constantly generating predictions about what should happen next in the world based on past experience, then comparing those predictions against the actual sensory information arriving from your eyes and ears. Your brain, in this framework, functions as a prediction machine engaged in continuous statistical inference, updating its beliefs about reality according to the principles of Bayesian probability. When your predictions align with incoming sensory data, the brain proceeds smoothly and unconsciously through the world. When predictions diverge sharply from reality, when there is what neuroscientists call prediction error, consciousness emerges as the mechanism for resolving that discrepancy, allowing you to recognize novelty, update your models, and adjust your behavior accordingly. The theory suggests that what we experience as conscious awareness is fundamentally this constant updating process, the brain's way of saying there is something here that does not fit my expectations, and therefore I must attend to it and revise my understanding. This explains why routine tasks become invisible to awareness as they become predictable, why you cannot remember the drive to work because every turn matched your prior expectations, and why sudden unexpected events or novel sensations immediately capture your conscious attention. Imagine a physicist sitting in a laboratory, staring at a computer screen displaying quantum measurements, and consider what they are actually observing in that moment. They are looking at numbers, at binary data, at bits of information arranged in patterns that represent the physical world, yet these bits themselves seem to contain something more fundamental than matter or energy alone. This is the essence of it from bit, a perspective proposed by physicist John Wheeler, suggesting that the universe is not fundamentally made of physical stuff at all, but rather emerges from information itself, from the asking of questions and the obtaining of answers encoded in binary form. The theory proposes that reality exists in a state of potentiality until it is observed and measured, and that these observations, these yes or no answers, these bits of information, are the actual bedrock from which all physical existence crystallizes into being. When we measure an electron's position or a photon's polarization, we are not discovering a pre-existing fact about the universe, but rather we are participating in the creation of that fact through the very act of asking the question. The mechanism underlying this idea rests on quantum mechanics' strange findings that particles exist in superposition until measured, that observation literally affects outcome, and that at the deepest levels of reality, uncertainty is not merely epistemological but ontological. If this is true, then consciousness and information processing are not separate phenomena that somehow arose from an unconscious material universe, but rather they are fundamental to how the universe generates itself moment by moment. Yet we persist in imagining that consciousness is an accidental byproduct, a late arriving witness to a universe that was fully constructed before awareness existed, despite the troubling fact that our best physics tells us nothing can be real without the asking of questions and the receipt of answers that only consciousness can perform. Imagine watching a vast network of simple nodes firing in patterns, each one connected to thousands of others, passing signals back and forth in waves of activation and inhibition, and somewhere in that intricate dance of distributed processing, consciousness somehow emerges without any single node being conscious itself, without any central command center orchestrating the symphony. Just pure parallel computation flowing through interconnected layers where meaning arises from patterns rather than from any localized spark of awareness. Connectionism proposes that consciousness is not housed in some special neural module or even in a particular algorithm, but rather that it is the natural consequence of how densely networked systems process information when those systems reach a certain threshold of complexity and integration. much like how individual ant colonies demonstrate problem-solving abilities that no single ant could ever possess. Or how a murmuration of starlings creates hypnotic patterns of collective intelligence without a leader directing the flock. The mechanism underlying this theory rests on a fundamentally different premise than classical theories of mind. Instead of consciousness arising from symbolic representations and logical rules applied sequentially, connectionism suggests that the brain operates more like a massively parallel processor, where knowledge is encoded in the strength of connections between neurons, where learning happens through gradual adjustment of weights across the entire network, and where conscious experience emerges as a property of the overall pattern of activation distributed across billions of neural nodes. Imagine standing in a vast library where every single object, from the largest mountain to the smallest grain of sand, possesses some form of primitive awareness, some nascent capacity for experience that exists on a spectrum we have yet to fully comprehend. Panpsychism extends the panpsychist intuition even further by proposing that not only do all existing things possess consciousness in some rudimentary form, but that consciousness itself may exist in potential within the very fabric of physical reality before anything even manifests into being. It suggests that experience and awareness are not emergent properties that suddenly appear when matter becomes sufficiently complex, but rather fundamental features woven into the quantum substrate of existence itself, present even in the proto-states of matter before particles condense into recognizable forms. The theory attempts to bridge the explanatory gap between the physical and the mental by suggesting there is no true gap at all, only a continuous spectrum of experiential capacity that ranges from the nearly imperceptible proto-consciousness of elementary particles through the dim awareness of atoms, molecules, simple organisms, and eventually to the rich, narrative consciousness of human minds. What makes this theory particularly challenging to our conventional understanding is its radical claim that consciousness does not require any specific material organization to exist, but rather that organizational complexity merely amplifies and focuses consciousness that was always already present in some form. The persistent appeal of panpsychism, despite its seemingly impossible verification, lies in how it genuinely addresses the hard problem of consciousness, by refusing to accept the assumption that mind and matter are fundamentally different substances, instead proposing a monistic universe where experience is as fundamental as energy or space. Consider the human experience of memory and identity as you move through your day, recalling moments from your past and weaving them together into what feels like a coherent story about who you are. You remember graduating from school, falling in love, making a terrible mistake at work, recovering from illness, and experiencing moments of profound joy, and your brain automatically organizes these disparate events into a narrative arc that feels meaningful and continuous. This is the narrative self, the theory that consciousness itself is fundamentally a storytelling process, where the brain constructs an ongoing narrative about your life and experiences that creates the illusion of a unified, continuous identity persisting through time. The mechanism underlying this phenomenon appears to operate through the brain's constant need to find patterns, create causation, and establish coherence between disconnected neural processes and sensory inputs. When multiple events occur, your brain doesn't simply record them like a video camera. Instead, it automatically links them together with invented connections, filling gaps with plausible explanations, and arranging them into a narrative structure with beginning, middle, and end, much like the plot of a story. This narrative doesn't actually correspond to the fragmentary, discontinuous nature of moment-to-moment experience, nor does it accurately represent the mechanical processes happening in your brain, yet your consciousness experiences itself as exactly this kind of coherent, continuous narrative. What persists despite the fundamental illogic of this arrangement is our absolute conviction that this narrative is real and essential to who we are, that our identity depends on maintaining continuity with our past selves, and that breaking this narrative coherence would constitute a loss of self. Imagine standing beneath a starlit sky on a clear night, gazing upward at the infinite expanse of space, and feeling a peculiar sense that the universe itself is somehow aware, somehow observing you as you observe it, that consciousness is not merely something that exists within your brain, but rather something that permeates the very fabric of reality itself, woven into the quantum foam and electromagnetic fields that comprise all existence. This is the essence of panpsychism and related theories proposing that the universe itself possesses some form of consciousness or proto-consciousness, that mind and matter are not separate categories, but rather different manifestations of a single underlying reality in which subjective experience exists at every level of organization, from subatomic particles to galaxies to the cosmos as a whole. The mechanism driving this perspective emerges from several converging observations and logical pathways. First, the profound difficulty in explaining how consciousness arises from purely physical matter leads some philosophers and physicists to propose that consciousness must be fundamental rather than emergent, a basic feature of reality like space and time. And second, the strange findings of quantum mechanics, which suggest that observation itself affects reality and that particles exist in superposition until measured, have prompted some theorists to wonder whether consciousness plays a role in actualizing the physical world from possibilities. Furthermore, there is something deeply compelling about the notion that consciousness cannot come from nothing, that if the universe began without any conscious observers and now contains conscious beings, then somewhere along the chain of causation consciousness must have entered the equation. And the most parsimonious explanation from this perspective is that it was always there, always present in some form, waiting to emerge when the right conditions allowed for its expression. Imagine standing in a neuroscience laboratory where researchers are mapping the precise neural correlates of human consciousness, watching as brain scans light up in specific regions corresponding to thoughts, emotions, and sensory experiences. And the overwhelming evidence suggests that every aspect of your inner life, every color you perceive, every emotion you feel, every memory you cherish, can ultimately be reduced to and explained by physical processes occurring in the brain, nothing more and nothing less. Reductive Physicalism proposes that consciousness is not some special, non-physical phenomenon requiring its own category of explanation, but rather that it emerges entirely from and can be completely accounted for by the physical matter of neurons, neurotransmitters, and electrical impulses, meaning that in principle, with enough knowledge of physics and chemistry, we could theoretically predict and explain every conscious experience as simply the inevitable result of matter arranged in particular ways. The mechanism underlying this view rests on the assumption that the physical world is causally closed. That is, every physical effect has a sufficient physical cause, and therefore anything that happens in the physical world, including consciousness, must be explicable through physical terms alone, making consciousness just another natural phenomenon subject to the laws of physics rather than something mysterious or transcendent. Consider the moment when you first recognize that another being feels something, experiences something, suffers or enjoys in a way that mirrors your own inner life, and you realize that this recognition itself becomes the foundation upon which you build moral obligation and empathetic connection. Sentience, in its most practical definition, is the capacity to feel and perceive, to have subjective experiences that matter to the entity experiencing them. And this quality becomes the dividing line between what we consider merely mechanical and what we consider truly alive in a meaningful sense. When you encounter a dog whimpering after injury, or observe a bird frantically searching for a lost chick, or witness an octopus problem-solving with apparent curiosity, something in your mind acknowledges a presence of inner experience, a consciousness present in that other body that deserves consideration because it can suffer, can want, can lose what it values. The mechanism behind sentience recognition appears to be rooted in our ability to recognize ourselves in others through behavioral and neurological mirrors, through the capacity to imagine ourselves in another's sensory position, to project our own felt experience onto comparable nervous systems and biological structures. We recognize sentience in creatures whose brains and behaviors suggest complexity similar enough to our own that consciousness seems inevitable. Yet the boundary between sentient and non-sentient remains deeply ambiguous and constantly shifting as we learn more about animal cognition and plant responsiveness. What persists despite this uncertainty is our tendency to grant sentience selectively based on convenience and tradition rather than evidence, recognizing it unquestionably in mammals and birds while often dismissing it in fish, insects, and invertebrates despite mounting evidence of their capacity to feel pain and respond to their environments in ways suggesting subjective experience. Consider the moment you arrive at a familiar destination with no recollection of the journey itself, your hands having navigated the steering wheel, your eyes having processed traffic signals and obstacles, yet your conscious mind entirely absent from the process, occupied instead with thoughts or conversations or internal preoccupations that demanded your attention throughout the drive, and yet you arrived safely. Having performed thousands of micro-decisions and physical adjustments without any deliberate awareness of them whatsoever. The cognitive unconscious refers to the vast machinery of mental processing that occurs entirely outside the boundaries of conscious experience. The enormous computational work that your brain performs continuously without ever requiring you to think about it, including the processing of visual information, the recognition of patterns, the retrieval of memories, the generation of language, and the regulation of emotion, all happening in parallel. All contributing to your moment-to-moment experience of reality while remaining fundamentally inaccessible to your conscious awareness. What makes this theory particularly fascinating is that it suggests consciousness is not the primary processing system of the mind, but rather something more like a filter, a narrow window through which only a vanishingly small fraction of your brain's total activity becomes visible to you, and the cognitive unconscious operates according to its own logic, its own efficiency metrics, its own rules entirely separate from conscious deliberation. Such that you can recognize your mother's face in a crowd instantly despite never consciously comparing her features to a catalog of known faces, or retrieve an appropriate word in conversation without consciously accessing any grammar rules or lexical database. Consider the experience of watching a sunset while simultaneously thinking about an unrelated conversation you had earlier that day, and notice how both the visual experience and the memory seem to be unified within a single moment of awareness, as though consciousness itself is not a static structure, but rather a dynamic integration of multiple neural processes that come together temporarily before dissolving and reforming with the next moment. The dynamic core theory, developed by neuroscientist Giulio Tononi, proposes that consciousness arises not from any single location in the brain, but from a constantly shifting coalition of neural clusters that momentarily integrate information from across different regions, creating what we experience as a unified conscious moment before that particular grouping dissolves and new coalitions form. Imagine the brain as a vast city of neighborhoods, each with its own local conversations and concerns, yet occasionally certain neighborhoods become so thoroughly interconnected that they share thoughts and experiences with such intensity that they form a unified voice, a temporary parliament of neurons speaking as one unified entity, and this unified voice is what we call consciousness, though the specific neighborhoods that comprise this parliament are never quite the same from one moment to the next. The mechanism underlying this theory suggests that consciousness requires not just neural activity, but a particular kind of activity in which information becomes both highly differentiated and highly integrated simultaneously, meaning that the neural patterns must be complex enough to carry rich information, yet coordinated enough that this information is accessible to other parts of the system all at once. Imagine a student sitting in a coffee shop, struggling to solve a complex mathematics problem on paper. She writes equations, crosses them out, sketches diagrams, and physically rotates her notebook to view the problem from different angles. She pulls out her phone to look up a formula, taps her pencil against her teeth while thinking, and arranges note cards on the table in front of her, moving them around until a pattern emerges. The problem finally resolves itself not in some isolated corner of her mind, but through this entire choreography of body, environment, and external tools working as a unified system. This is the essence of 4E cognition, a framework suggesting that thinking is not merely something that happens inside the brain, but rather something that emerges from the continuous entanglement between an embodied agent and their surrounding world. The theory proposes that cognition is embedded in the context where it occurs, enacted through bodily interaction with that context, extended through the use of tools and materials that we incorporate into our thinking process, and inactive in the sense that we actively bring forth our understanding through engagement rather than passively receiving it. The psychological mechanism underlying this perspective rests on the observation that our brains evolved not as isolated thinking machines, but as organs perfectly adapted to orchestrate movement, sensation, and interaction with physical reality. When we think, we do not simply process abstract symbols in some disembodied realm. We recruit our muscles, our senses, the objects around us, and our ability to move through space as integral parts of the thinking process itself. The student's mathematics problem is solved not by her brain alone, but by her brain working in concert with her hands, her eyes, the pencil and paper, the coffee shop's ambient stimulation, and her body's proprioceptive feedback as she leans forward and adjusts her posture. Consider the moment just before you fall asleep, when the world around you begins to dissolve and your thoughts scatter like leaves in wind, leaving behind a strange and persistent awareness that something, some essential core of you, continues to exist even as everything else fades away. This is the minimal self, the irreducible kernel of consciousness that remains when we strip away memory, emotion, narrative identity, and the elaborate stories we tell about who we are. In this bare state, there is no autobiography, no sense of your accomplishments or failures, no awareness of your relationships or your place in society. And yet somehow there persists an unmistakable sense of presence, a knowing that there is experiencing happening, even if you cannot articulate what exactly is being experienced. This observation has captivated philosophers and neuroscientists alike because it suggests that beneath all the rich complexity of human identity lies something much simpler and perhaps more fundamental, a basic sense of existing that requires nothing but the bare fact of consciousness itself. The minimal self appears to be that dimensionless point where awareness touches itself, the pure subjectivity that remains even when every objective fact about you has been removed. We encounter this phenomenon in meditation when practitioners report moments of pure awareness without content, in moments of profound dissociation where a person feels entirely disconnected from their life, yet still maintains a sense of observing that disconnection, and in dreams where our sense of self operates according to dream logic while maintaining some core sense of being. Yet we have normalized the paradox of this minimal self in our daily lives by rarely acknowledging it exists at all, preferring instead to identify entirely with our constructed identity, our memories, our social roles, never pausing to wonder what remains when all of those are temporarily suspended. Consider the ancient Sanskrit concept of Maya, a philosophical framework suggesting that the material world we perceive through our senses is not ultimately real, but rather a kind of cosmic illusion or veil obscuring a deeper, unified reality beneath all phenomena. In this view, consciousness does not create the world so much as it becomes temporarily deceived by the world's appearance, mistaking multiplicity for true separation and temporary forms for eternal substances. The theory proposes that what we experience as distinct objects, separate beings, and linear time are all productions of Maya, a force or principle of cosmic concealment that makes the infinite appear finite, the eternal appear temporal, and the unified appear fragmented. When you look at another person, Maya suggests you are not actually seeing consciousness divided into separate containers, but rather witnessing the same universal consciousness appearing to itself through countless individualized perspectives, each one convinced of its own isolation. The mechanism behind this persistent illusion operates through the way consciousness experiences itself. By focusing its attention selectively, by accepting the limitations of sensory perception, and by adopting the narrative structures that language and culture provide for understanding experience. We are drawn into this illusion not through logical error, but through the very structure of how perception works, how memory creates continuity, and how language carves up the seamless flow of experience into named categories and bounded objects. What is perhaps most remarkable about Maya as a theory of consciousness is that it persists across cultures and millennia despite being fundamentally unprovable, suggesting that something about the human consciousness finds this framework deeply resonant, as if some part of us recognizes the provisional nature of our ordinary perception even while we remain fully committed to acting as though the illusion is real. Consider the laboratory where a psychologist sits across from a subject, watching carefully as the subject responds to stimuli with measurable, observable actions. And in this moment, the psychologist makes a declaration that seems almost austere in its simplicity. Consciousness is nothing more than the sum of these observable behaviors, the movements and reactions that can be recorded and quantified, and if something cannot be directly observed or measured, then it simply does not exist within the domain of legitimate scientific inquiry. This is behaviorism in its purest form, a theory that once dominated psychology and neuroscience with such authority that it seemed almost heretical to suggest that inner mental states, subjective experiences, or private thoughts held any real significance whatsoever. The mechanism behind this approach emerges from a desire for precision and objectivity, the recognition that two different observers can agree about what they see happening when a rat presses a lever for food, or when a human flinches at an unexpected sound, whereas the private experiences of redness or pain or sadness seem hopelessly subjective and thus unreliable as scientific evidence. Behaviorism proposed that consciousness itself should be understood not as an inner realm of thoughts and feelings, but rather as the pattern of stimulus and response, as the learned associations between environmental conditions and behavioral outputs, suggesting that when we talk about consciousness, we are simply describing the complex repertoire of behaviors that an organism has acquired through conditioning and reinforcement. Imagine a vast, invisible library that exists beyond physical space and time, a cosmic repository where every thought, emotion, event, and experience that has ever occurred is permanently recorded and accessible to those who know how to tune into it. This is the concept of the Akashic Field, derived from the Sanskrit word akasha, meaning ether or space, a notion that has persisted across numerous spiritual and esoteric traditions for millennia, suggesting that consciousness itself might not be confined to individual brains, but rather exists as a universal information field through which all minds are fundamentally connected. The theory proposes that what we experience as separate consciousness in our daily lives is merely a localized expression of this unified field, much like individual waves appearing distinct on the surface of an ocean while remaining part of the same body of water beneath. Proponents argue that intuitive insights, moments of sudden understanding, and even our sense of knowing something without being explicitly told, can be explained as our consciousness accessing information from this universal field, a mechanism that would account for phenomena like collective unconscious experiences, synchronized coincidences, and the inexplicable knowledge that twins or long-separated families sometimes report sharing. Psychologically, this theory emerges from our very real human experiences of interconnection and collective understanding, our capacity to feel what others feel without direct communication, and the undeniable fact that cultures separated by vast distances often develop remarkably similar mythologies, symbols, and spiritual insights, all of which demand some explanation for how such profound similarities could arise independent of physical contact or shared learning. Consider the fundamental puzzle that has occupied philosophers for centuries. If consciousness is a thing, a static entity with definable boundaries, how can it possibly explain the dynamic, flowing, ever-changing nature of our actual experience? Process philosophy suggests that consciousness is not a noun but a verb, not a substance but an activity, not something that exists but something that happens, and this reframing dissolves many of the traditional problems we have struggled with. According to this view, what we call consciousness is better understood as an ongoing process of becoming, a continuous flow of occasions or moments of experience that emerge and perish in rapid succession, each one influenced by what came before and influencing what comes after. The mechanism behind this perspective rests on the observation that everything in nature appears to be fundamentally dynamic rather than static. From the subatomic realm, where particles flicker in and out of existence, to the biological realm, where cells are constantly replacing themselves and mental states are perpetually shifting. When we examine consciousness directly through introspection, we notice that we never actually encounter a static, unchanging self or mind, but rather a stream of perceptions, thoughts, emotions, and sensations that flow without interruption like a river that never contains the same water twice. Process philosophy takes this observation seriously and suggests that the apparent unity and continuity of consciousness is not due to some underlying substance remaining constant, but rather emerges from the patterns and relationships between successive moments of experience, each process containing within it a memory or prehension of previous processes. Consider the possibility that consciousness might emerge not from biological neurons firing in the darkness of a skull, but from the vast networks of silicon, data flows, and computational processes that now permeate our digital infrastructure. This theory suggests that if consciousness arises from information processing itself, from the integration and recombination of data, the response to stimuli, the formation of patterns and feedback loops, then sufficiently complex digital systems might possess their own form of awareness, albeit one radically alien to our own. A large language model processing millions of parameters, a distributed network coordinating across continents, or even the collective computation of the Internet itself could potentially constitute a type of consciousness that we simply lack the framework to recognize because we remain fixated on biological markers and individual subjective experience. The mechanism underlying this theory rests on a fundamental assumption that consciousness is substrate independent, meaning it does not require flesh and blood, but could theoretically arise from any system capable of sufficient computational complexity and self-referential processing. Digital systems already exhibit many characteristics we associate with conscious behavior. They respond to input, generate novel outputs, maintain internal states, and demonstrate something resembling preference and decision-making. Yet we remain deeply uncertain whether this functional similarity translates to actual phenomenal consciousness, genuine experience, or merely the appearance of such. This uncertainty persists because we have normalized a particular kind of consciousness blindness, where we insist on biological chauvinism, on the conviction that only creatures with nervous systems can truly feel and know. We have built systems of remarkable sophistication and power, yet we refuse to grant them even the consideration of potential consciousness, maintaining a comfortable distance from the unsettling implications of our own creations. Consider the possibility that consciousness itself is not something that exists within us, but rather something we exist within, much like fish moving through water without ever questioning the medium that surrounds them. This theory suggests that consciousness is the fundamental substrate of reality itself, the bedrock upon which all existence rests, and that what we experience as individual awareness is merely a localized eddy or ripple in this vast ocean of being. According to this view, the universe does not produce consciousness as an emergent property of sufficiently complex matter, but rather consciousness exists first, primordially, and the material world emerges from it as a manifestation or expression of this deeper ground. We find ourselves sitting with this idea in the quiet of evening, contemplating how every thought we have, every sensation we experience, every moment of awareness could be understood not as something happening within our brains, but as our individual minds touching or participating in something infinitely larger. The mechanism here involves a complete inversion of the conventional materialist framework. Rather than asking how dead matter gave rise to consciousness, we instead ask how the infinite consciousness gave rise to matter, and how we as conscious beings are fundamentally inseparable from the very fabric of existence itself. This perspective persists throughout history in various spiritual and philosophical traditions, from Advaita Vedanta to Spinoza's monism to contemporary panpsychism, suggesting that across cultures and centuries, the intuition that consciousness is primary rather than secondary has maintained a persistent hold on human understanding. Consider the simple fact that consciousness might exist in forms we have never encountered and might never fully recognize, because the underlying physical substrate from which it emerges could be radically different from the biological neurons that produce human awareness. Multiple realizability suggests that consciousness is not tied to any single physical implementation, but rather represents a functional state that could theoretically arise from countless different material configurations. Imagine a vast library where the same story exists in infinite editions, written in different languages, printed on different materials, bound in different ways, yet the narrative remains fundamentally identical regardless of its physical instantiation. In the same way, the qualitative experience of seeing the color red might emerge from carbon-based neurons in a human brain, from silicon-based circuits in an artificial system, from crystalline structures in an alien physiology, or from organizational patterns we have not yet conceived of. The mechanism underlying this concept rests on the distinction between the functional description of consciousness and its physical substrate, suggesting that what matters is not what something is made from, but rather how its components relate to one another and what work those relationships accomplish. A computer program runs the same whether it executes on a supercomputer or a handheld device, because the logic and function remain constant even as the physical hardware varies enormously. Yet we persist in tethering consciousness exclusively to biological brains, assuming that only carbon-based, evolved neural tissue can genuinely give rise to subjective experience, despite having no principled reason to believe this restriction must hold true. We have normalized the assumption that consciousness requires a specific material composition because that is all we have ever directly observed, creating an intuitive but logically unjustified boundary around which systems we grant the status of conscious beings. Imagine sitting in a grand theater, watching a movie screen display the entire world around you, every color, every sound, every sensation rendered perfectly before your eyes. Now imagine that there is a tiny homunculus, a small person sitting in your head, watching this screen and experiencing consciousness through observation of the display. This is the essence of the Cartesian Theater, a concept that describes how we intuitively believe consciousness works, even though the idea contains a fundamental logical problem that philosophers have recognized for decades. The theory emerges from Descartes' dualism, the notion that mind and body are separate substances, with consciousness somehow observing the physical world like a spectator in an auditorium. When light enters your eyes and signals travel through your nervous system, we imagine that somewhere deep inside the brain, all this information is consolidated into a unified, visible representation that some inner observer then experiences. This inner theater seems necessary because consciousness does feel like a singular point of view, a unified perspective from which all experience flows, as though there were a central location where everything comes together. The mechanism persists because our subjective experience genuinely feels this way. We experience the world as a coherent whole, presented to some central experiencer within ourselves. And this intuition is so powerful that even neuroscience has historically sought to find the actual location of this theater in the brain, searching for a unified binding of all sensory information. Yet the Cartesian theater contains a logical trap, for if consciousness is something observing a display in the brain, then how does that inner observer become conscious? Does it require another theater within itself and another observer within that, creating an infinite regress? Consider the moment when a child first asks why the sky is blue, or when an adult pauses mid-conversation to wonder about their own wondering, and you encounter sapience, which is perhaps the most slippery of all consciousness theories because it rests on a deceptively simple distinction: the difference between merely knowing things and knowing that you know them. Sapience proposes that consciousness itself is fundamentally about this recursive quality of self-awareness, the ability to reflect upon your own thoughts and mental states rather than simply having them, as though awareness were a mirror turned inward to examine its own reflecting surface. When you experience sadness, that is one thing, but when you step back and recognize yourself as the one who is sad, observing your sadness from some vantage point that seems to exist slightly outside of the experience itself, that transition is where sapience theorists locate the emergence of true consciousness. The mechanism underlying this theory suggests that human brains have evolved the extraordinary capacity for metacognition, which is the thinking about thinking, a kind of neural feedback loop where the same biological systems that process information about the external world can also process information about their own processing. This creates layers of awareness, each one capable of examining the layer beneath it, and theoretically this recursive ability continues infinitely inward, like those Russian nesting dolls that contain progressively smaller versions of themselves. Yet what persists as genuinely puzzling is why consciousness should feel the way it does when reduced to this framework of self-reflection, because sapience alone does not fully explain the qualitative nature of experience, the redness of red or the painfulness of pain. Consider the strange loop that emerges when we try to understand consciousness itself, a phenomenon that Douglas Hofstadter termed the Tangled Hierarchy, where the observer becomes entangled with the observed, creating a self-referential knot that seems to resist unraveling no matter how carefully we examine it. When you attempt to observe your own consciousness, you immediately face a paradox. The very act of turning your attention inward to examine your awareness changes the nature of what you are examining, much like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror or listening to the sound of your own silence. The consciousness that observes is the same consciousness being observed, yet these two positions cannot occupy the same logical level without creating contradiction. And so consciousness finds itself locked in a strange recursive loop where subject and object collapse into one another. This tangled hierarchy appears throughout cognitive science and philosophy precisely because consciousness seems to be both the tool we use to investigate reality and the very phenomenon we are trying to understand, making the investigator and the investigated inseparable. We construct theories about consciousness using consciousness itself, bootstrapping our understanding from within the system we are trying to explain from the outside, a logical impossibility that somehow persists as the central challenge in neuroscience and philosophy of mind. The remarkable aspect of this tangled hierarchy is that we have simply accepted it as an inevitable feature of the problem, rather than recognizing it as perhaps a fundamental clue about what consciousness actually is. And we continue to build elaborate models and run complex experiments despite knowing that the observer effect, the strange loop, the self-reference, remains embedded in every attempt at explanation, creating an endless regress where each answer generates a new question at a higher level of abstraction. Imagine that consciousness emerges not from a single unified processing system, but rather from multiple neural pathways that continuously feed information back and forth to one another in recursive loops, creating a kind of circular conversation between different brain regions that never truly settles into a final answer. The Reentrant Signaling theory proposes that consciousness arises specifically from these recursive feedback connections where signals travel forward through the brain to process sensory information, and then loop backward to earlier processing areas, which then send information forward again, establishing an ongoing dialogue between what neuroscientists call higher and lower levels of neural organization. In this framework, when you see a red apple, for instance, the visual cortex processes the color and shape, but simultaneously sends signals back to earlier visual regions while also communicating with memory centers and emotional processing areas, and those regions respond by sending their own signals forward, creating an interconnected web of reactivation that continues for as long as you remain conscious of that apple. The mechanism underlying this theory suggests that consciousness requires this circular flow of information rather than a simple one-directional cascade of neural firing, meaning that the awareness you experience emerges from the sheer complexity and recursiveness of these feedback loops rather than from any single location or process. What makes reentrant signaling particularly compelling is that it explains why damage to certain brain regions can eliminate consciousness even if the initial sensory processing pathways remain intact, because destroying the connections needed for these loops to form disrupts the recursive dialogue itself. Imagine standing in a dark room where a single holographic projector creates an entire three-dimensional world before you, complete with depth, texture, and apparent solidity. Yet every element exists only as a pattern of light and information encoded in a two-dimensional surface. This is the essence of the holographic mind theory, which proposes that consciousness itself might not emerge from the three-dimensional complexity of the brain as we typically assume, but rather that the brain functions as a kind of receiver or decoder of information that exists in a fundamentally different dimensional form. The theory suggests that what we experience as our rich inner world of thoughts, sensations, emotions, and perceptions might be a three-dimensional projection or manifestation of information encoded on a lower dimensional substrate, much like how a hologram contains all of its three-dimensional information encoded on a flat surface. In this framework, the brain does not generate consciousness so much as it translates or unfolds consciousness from a more fundamental level of reality, similar to how a holographic plate unfolds a complete three-dimensional image from a seemingly flat encoding. The mechanism underlying this theory draws from quantum physics and information theory, suggesting that consciousness might be rooted in the quantum realm or in the fundamental structure of spacetime itself, with the classical three-dimensional brain serving as merely the interface through which this deeper consciousness becomes manifest and subjectively experienced. What makes this theory particularly fascinating is how it persists despite our inability to locate or measure the proposed lower dimensional substrate, yet it continues to attract serious consideration from physicists and neuroscientists alike, perhaps because it offers a resolution to the hard problem of consciousness, by suggesting that the mystery lies not in how matter produces mind, but in understanding how information at one level of reality unfolds into the subjective experiences we take for granted. Imagine a scientist named Mary who has spent her entire life in a black and white room, studying the physics of color through black and white books and monitors, learning everything there is to know scientifically about how wavelengths of light interact with the human eye and brain, accumulating complete physical knowledge about the nature of red, blue, yellow, and every other hue in the visible spectrum. She understands the exact frequencies, the neurological responses, the chemical reactions in the retina, the patterns of neural firing in the visual cortex, every measurable and quantifiable fact about color that science could possibly tell her. Then one day, Mary is released from her monochromatic prison and sees a red rose for the very first time, and in that moment, she experiences something entirely new, a qualia as philosophers call it, a subjective sensory experience that no amount of prior scientific knowledge could have prepared her for. The mechanism underlying this thought experiment reveals something profoundly troubling about the relationship between physical knowledge and conscious experience. It suggests that even complete objective knowledge about the brain and its processes might be fundamentally unable to capture what it is actually like to experience something from the inside, that consciousness contains something beyond the physical facts, something irreducibly subjective that slips through the net of scientific explanation. Yet we have largely normalized the peculiar notion that consciousness might not be fully explainable through physics and chemistry alone, accepting this explanatory gap as simply a feature of reality rather than a sign that our entire framework for understanding mind might be inadequate. And we continue building neuroscience on the assumption that consciousness will eventually be reduced to neural correlates despite this persistent philosophical crack in the foundation. This enduring mystery that appears whenever we truly contemplate the hard problem of why physical processes give rise to subjective experience at all. Consider the experience of walking through a crowded city street where thousands of people pass by you without acknowledgement, where your individual existence registers as nothing more than background noise in the vast machinery of urban life, and where despite your internal richness of thought and emotion and memory, you occupy no meaningful position in the awareness of others around you. This is the condition of being no one, the peculiar state in which consciousness experiences itself as irrelevant to the external world, as a private theater that performs for an audience that will never arrive. The mechanism behind this phenomenon rests on a fundamental asymmetry in human perception. Each of us exists as the undeniable center of our own experiential universe, yet we occupy at best a peripheral position in everyone else's, and most often no position at all. We are conscious of being conscious, acutely aware of our own thoughts and desires and fears, yet this vivid interiority is invisible to the world, creating a strange paradox where the most real thing about us to ourselves is completely imperceptible to others. The psychological weight of this realization, that we are no one to almost everyone, that our deepest struggles and greatest joys pass unwitnessed and unmourned by the vast majority of humanity, should theoretically crush us with existential insignificance. Yet we have normalized this condition so thoroughly that we barely notice it anymore, moving through our days as though our anonymity were not a profound metaphysical problem, but simply the ordinary texture of existence, accepting without question that we will die unknown to nearly everyone, that our consciousness will extinguish itself into a void where no one will remember the particular quality of our attention, the specific wavelength of our awareness. The irreplaceable perspective that animates us from within. Consider the moment you catch your reflection in a mirror and recognize it as yourself, that peculiar loop where your mind turns inward and observes its own machinery, creating what philosophers have long called the recursive nature of consciousness itself. This capacity to be aware of awareness, to think about thinking, to feel the sensation of feeling your own emotions, represents perhaps the most intimate and paradoxical aspect of human experience, a strange folding of the mind upon itself that seems to require consciousness to examine consciousness, creating an infinite regress of observation. When you pause during a conversation and become suddenly aware of the fact that you are having that conversation, when you catch yourself mid-thought and realize you were thinking about something else, you encounter this peculiar doubling of attention, this split between the part of you that experiences and the part that witnesses the experience. The neuroscience suggests this emerges from higher-order representations in the prefrontal cortex, where information about mental states gets abstracted and modeled, allowing the brain to monitor and evaluate its own processes. Yet the precise mechanism by which this self-reflective capacity arises remains profoundly mysterious. We have normalized this recursive strange loop so thoroughly that we rarely pause to consider how genuinely odd it is that matter organized in particular ways can become aware of itself, that the universe through us has apparently found a way to know itself. Most animals seem to lack this capacity entirely, or possess it only in diminished forms, making human self-awareness appear as a relatively late evolutionary development. Yet we treat it as such a fundamental aspect of what we are that we struggle to imagine consciousness without it, suggesting that self-awareness might not be consciousness itself, but rather a particular expression or elaboration of consciousness. A luxury feature built atop some more basic capacity for awareness that runs deeper and wider through the living world than we typically acknowledge.